In the year 678 AD, beneath a blood-red Mediterranean sky, the most terrifying weapon in medieval history unleashed its fury upon the Arab fleet besieging Constantinople. This was not ordinary fire. This was Greek fire, a liquid flame that defied every law of nature known to medieval man, burning with such ferocious intensity that water itself became its accomplice rather than its enemy. When Arab sailors, their ships engulfed in supernatural flames, desperately leaped into the sea seeking salvation, they discovered only horror. The water around them erupted into walls of fire, turning the Mediterranean into a boiling cauldron of death. The scene was apocalyptic. Imagine hundreds of warships, their wooden hulls groaning under the weight of soldiers and siege equipment, suddenly transformed into floating infernos. The Arab chroniclers, those who survived to tell the tale, wrote of flames that stuck to everything like glue and pursued men into the depths. They described a liquid that sprayed from bronze tubes mounted on Byzantine warships, shooting streams of fire that could reach enemy vessels from impossible distances. The sound alone was said to be thunderous, like divine wrath made manifest. What made this weapon so utterly terrifying was not merely its destructive power, though that was considerable. It was the psychological devastation it wreaked upon anyone who witnessed it. Soldiers who had faced countless battles, warriors hardened by years of desert campaigns and bloody sieges, broke ranks and fled in panic at the mere sight of Byzantine fireships approaching. Medieval warfare had its share of horrors, but nothing compared to being burned alive by flames that laughed at water, that seemed to possess an evil intelligence in their pursuit of human flesh. The Arab fleet that day numbered over 200 warships, a massive armada that had sailed with confidence toward what they believed would be the final conquest of the Byzantine capital. They had reason for optimism. The Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former glory, having lost Syria, Egypt, and North Africa to the Islamic conquests in just 4 decades. Constantinople stood as the last great bastion of Christian power in the East, and its fall seemed inevitable. The Arabs had siege engines, experienced marines, and the momentum of an empire ascending. But they had not accounted for Greek fire. As their ships closed in on the Byzantine fleet defending the Golden Horn, the defenders unleashed hell. From specially designed tubes protruding from the prows of Byzantine dromons, pressurized streams of liquid fire shot forth, arcing through the air like dragon's breath. The first Arab ships hit by this weapon disintegrated into chaos within minutes. Flames spread with unnatural speed across decks, uprigging, consuming sails and timber with equal appetite. Men covered in the sticky, burning substance dove into the sea, only to watch in horror as the flames followed them beneath the waves. The Byzantine weapon operators, elite specialists called siphonarioi, worked their bronze apparatus with practiced precision. They knew the exact pressure needed, the optimal angle of trajectory, the vulnerable points on enemy ships. This was not a weapon that could be wielded by just anyone. It required years of training, intimate knowledge of chemistry and pressure systems, and nerves of steel to operate, while enemy arrows and spears filled the air around them. These men were the equivalent of modern special forces, guardians of the empire's most deadly secret. Contemporary accounts describe the Arab fleet's complete disintegration. Ships collided with each other as captains desperately tried to escape the range of the fire-spewing dromons. Some vessels, their crews already dead or dying, drifted as floating pyres, spreading panic through the armada. The smell of burning wood, tar, and human flesh filled the air for miles. The sea itself seemed to burn, covered as it was with the oily residue of Greek fire floating on the surface, igniting anything that touched it. What happened next would determine the fate of Europe for the next 8 centuries. The Arab siege, which had seemed so close to success, collapsed. The demoralized fleet withdrew, its commanders recognizing that they possessed no counter to this Byzantine superweapon. In subsequent engagements over the following years, every time Arab ships attempted to force the straits, Greek fire drove them back. The weapon created an impenetrable shield around Constantinople, a barrier of flame that no medieval navy dared to cross. But here is where our story takes its most intriguing turn. This weapon that saved Christian Europe from conquest, this technological marvel that allowed the Byzantine Empire to survive another 800 years, this Greek fire that terrified the medieval world, completely disappeared. Not just the weapon itself, but the knowledge of how to make it. The formula, despite being one of the most guarded secrets in history, was lost entirely. No blueprint survived, no recipe remained, no apprentice preserved the technique. It vanished as if it had never existed, leaving only scattered references in ancient texts and the traumatized accounts of those who faced it in battle. This disappearance represents one of history's greatest mysteries. How does a weapon so important, so carefully guarded, so extensively used for 500 years, simply cease to exist? Modern historians and chemists have spent over a century trying to recreate it, analyzing every scrap of evidence, every cryptic reference in Byzantine military manuals. They have proposed dozens of formulas, tested countless combinations of medieval ingredients, built replica siphons and pressure systems. Some have come close. None have succeeded in recreating the exact properties described in historical accounts. The first use of Greek fire in 678 was not its invention, but rather its debut on the grand stage of history. The weapon had been developed a decade earlier, around 668 AD, by a man whose name would become legendary in Byzantine military circles: Callinicus. He was a refugee, an architect and engineer from Heliopolis in Syria, a city that had recently fallen to Arab conquest. Callinicus fled to Constantinople, bringing with him either genius or stolen secrets, depending on which historical interpretation you believe. The Byzantine emperor, desperate for any advantage against the seemingly unstoppable Arab expansion, gave Callinicus unlimited resources to develop his incendiary weapon. Within a few years, Callinicus had transformed an idea, or perhaps an ancient formula he had discovered, into a practical weapon system. He designed not just the liquid fire itself, but the entire delivery mechanism, the pumps and tubes and valves needed to project it at enemy ships. He trained the first siphonarioi in the weapon's use, teaching them the careful balance of pressure and timing needed to maximize its effect. He supervised the installation of the apparatus on Byzantine warships, ensuring that each vessel could become a floating fortress of flame. The secret of Greek fire was so closely guarded that even today, more than 1,000 years after its last recorded use, we cannot say with certainty what it contained. We know it involved petroleum products, probably naphtha or crude oil from natural seeps around the Black Sea. We know it contained substances that made it stick to surfaces, likely tree resins or pitch. We know it included components that allowed it to burn on water, possibly quicklime that reacted violently with moisture. But the exact proportions, the specific ingredients, the precise method of preparation, all of this knowledge died with the last Byzantine fire engineers sometime in the 13th century. What we do know is that Greek fire changed naval warfare forever. Before its invention, sea battles were essentially land battles fought on floating platforms. Ships would ram each other, grapple together, and Marines would fight hand-to-hand on decks. Greek fire introduced the concept of standoff attack, the ability to destroy enemy vessels from a distance without closing to boarding range. It gave the Byzantines a decisive technological advantage that compensated for their declining military manpower and economic resources. One dromon equipped with Greek fire could scatter an entire enemy squadron. The psychological impact of the weapon cannot be overstated. Medieval chroniclers from multiple cultures, Byzantine, Arab, Russian, and Western European, all describe Greek fire in terms usually reserved for divine or demonic intervention. They called it liquid fire, sea fire, Roman fire, artificial fire, and prepared fire. Arab writers referred to it as naft, linking it to the Persian word for petroleum, and described it with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. Russian chronicles recounting their failed naval attacks on Constantinople speak of the lightning from heaven that destroyed their fleets. The terror Greek fire inspired lasted for centuries. Long after the weapon had disappeared, the mere rumor that Byzantine ships carried it was enough to make enemy admirals reconsider their tactics. This reputation for invincibility at sea became part of Byzantine diplomatic arsenal, a deterrent that worked even when the actual weapons might not have been present. The empire cultivated this fear deliberately, spreading stories of the fire's supernatural properties, hinting at divine favor and ancient secrets beyond mortal understanding. But in 678 AD, as the Arab fleet burned and sank beneath the walls of Constantinople, none of this future history mattered. What mattered was that the city had been saved, the empire had been granted a reprieve, and a new weapon had announced itself to the world. The age of Greek fire had begun, an age that would last 5 centuries before ending in mystery and loss. The flames that saved Byzantium would burn themselves into legend, leaving behind questions that still smolder today, waiting for answers that may never come. The Byzantine Empire of the 7th century was dying, slowly bleeding from 1,000 cuts inflicted by enemies on every frontier. To understand why Greek fire became so crucial, why its development was pursued with such desperate urgency, we must first grasp the existential crisis facing Constantinople in those dark decades. This was not merely a matter of losing battles or territories. The very survival of Christian civilization in the East hung by a thread, and that thread was fraying rapidly. Just 40 years before Greek fire's debut in 678, the Byzantine Empire had been the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Emperor Heraclius had achieved what seemed impossible, defeating the mighty Persian Empire in a series of brilliant campaigns that restored Byzantine prestige and recovered lost territories. Jerusalem, captured by Persians in 614, was liberated. The true cross, stolen from the Holy Sepulchre, was triumphantly returned. It appeared that Byzantine power would continue for another 1,000 years, as it had for the previous 1,000. Then came the Arabs. Emerging from the Arabian Peninsula with a new faith and unified purpose, Arab armies swept through the Middle East like a desert storm. In 636, just 2 years after Prophet Muhammad's death, they destroyed a Byzantine army at the Battle of Yarmouk in Syria. This single defeat opened the floodgates. Within 5 years, the entire Levant fell to Arab conquest. Damascus, Antioch, Jerusalem, all the great cities of Syria and Palestine that had been Byzantine for centuries, were lost. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. Egypt followed in 641. The fertile Nile Valley, breadbasket of the empire, source of grain that fed Constantinople's population, was ripped away. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great and home to the greatest library of the ancient world, surrendered after a brief siege. The loss of Egypt was catastrophic, not just militarily, but economically. Byzantine tax revenues plummeted. The empire's ability to feed its capital and pay its armies diminished drastically. Each loss made the next loss more likely, creating a downward spiral that seemed impossible to reverse. North Africa, that wealthy string of provinces stretching from Egypt to Morocco, fell piece by piece over the following decades. Carthage, once Rome's greatest rival and now a Byzantine stronghold, was captured in 698. The Mediterranean, which Romans had called our sea, was no longer secure. Arab fleets, built with timber from conquered lands and manned by converted populations who knew these waters intimately, began raiding Byzantine islands and coastal cities. The empire was being strangled, cut off from its remaining territories by enemies who controlled the sea lanes. But the Arab threat was only one of many. From the north, Slavic tribes poured across the Danube, settling in the Balkans and pushing toward Constantinople itself. These were not organized armies, but mass migrations, entire peoples seeking new lands. They could not be defeated in a single battle because there was no single enemy to fight. Byzantine control of the Balkans, the empire's European heartland, dissolved like morning mist. Cities were abandoned, farmlands reverted to wilderness, and the population fled to fortified coastal towns or across the sea to Asia Minor. The Bulgars presented yet another threat. These Turkic warriors had established themselves south of the Danube by the mid-7th century, creating a powerful khanate that immediately came into conflict with Byzantine interests. Unlike the Slavs, the Bulgars were organized, militarized, and ambitious. They wanted not just to raid, but to conquer, to establish their own empire on Byzantine soil. Their cavalry was formidable, their tactics sophisticated, and their hatred of Constantinople visceral. Even the Lombards in Italy, technically less threatening than Arabs or Bulgars, nibbled away at Byzantine holdings on the peninsula. The Exarchate of Ravenna, the empire's administrative center in the west, was under constant pressure. Rome itself, though still nominally Byzantine, was increasingly independent, looking to its own pope for leadership rather than to the distant emperor in Constantinople. The empire's control of Italy, never complete even at the best of times, was fragmenting into isolated enclaves. Constantinople stood at the center of this collapsing world like a besieged fortress. The city's massive walls, built by Emperor Theodosius II in the 5th century, were still formidable. The Theodosian walls consisted of a moat, an outer wall, a terrace, and a massive inner wall studded with towers. They had never been breached by direct assault. But walls alone could not save an empire. The city needed food, which came by sea. It needed trade, which required secure shipping lanes. It needed tax revenue from provinces, most of which were now lost or besieged. The empire's military situation was dire. The old Roman legionary system had long since evolved into a thematic system, where soldiers were also farmers, granted land in exchange for military service. But this system required stable territories to function. As provinces fell to invaders, both the land and the soldiers who worked it were lost. The empire's field armies, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands, had shrunk to perhaps 100,000 men total, scattered across multiple fronts, never concentrated enough to win decisive victories. Naval power became the empire's lifeline. If Byzantine ships could control the sea approaches to Constantinople, the city could survive even as land territories fell. The Bosphorus, that narrow strait connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, became the most strategically vital waterway in the world. Control of the Bosphorus meant Constantinople could receive grain from the Black Sea ports, maintain communication with remaining Asian provinces, and prevent enemy fleets from coordinating attacks from multiple directions. Lose control of the Bosphorus, and the city would starve. This is why the Arab naval threat was so terrifying. Arab armies had proven they could defeat Byzantine forces on land, but Byzantine naval supremacy remained intact through the 650s and 660s. Byzantine dromons, the empire's standard warships, were sophisticated vessels powered by both sails and oars, capable of ramming attacks and carrying substantial numbers of marines. Byzantine sailors had centuries of experience, inherited from Greek and Roman maritime traditions. The empire's shipyards could still produce vessels of high quality, but the Arabs were learning fast. They recruited Byzantine shipwrights, sometimes by force, sometimes through bribery or conversion. They studied captured Byzantine vessels, reverse engineering their design. They established their own shipyards in Syria and Egypt, using the same timber and techniques as their enemies. By the 670s, Arab fleets were beginning to challenge Byzantine naval dominance. They raided Byzantine islands, captured Cyprus, and even attacked Constantinople's outer harbors. The naval superiority that had protected the empire was eroding. Emperor Constantine IV, ruling from 668 to 685, understood that conventional naval tactics would not be enough. Arab fleets were now equal or superior in numbers and were improving in quality. Byzantine ship crews were demoralized by decades of retreat and defeat on land. The empire needed an equalizer, a technological advantage so overwhelming that it could compensate for declining resources and manpower. This is the context in which Callinicus arrived in Constantinople with his fire weapon proposal. The strategic calculus was brutal in its simplicity. Constantinople must not fall. If the capital fell, the empire would cease to exist as a meaningful political entity. The remaining provinces would fragment into independent statelets or be absorbed by neighboring powers. Christian civilization in the East would be extinguished or absorbed into the expanding Islamic world. The cultural and religious consequences would reshape world history. Everything depended on holding Constantinople, and holding Constantinople depended on controlling the seas around it. The emperor's decision to invest heavily in Callinicus's fire weapon was not a gamble, but a desperate necessity. Traditional weapons had failed to stop the Arab advance. Traditional tactics had proven inadequate against enemies who matched or exceeded Byzantine capabilities in conventional warfare. Only a revolutionary weapon, something that would shock and terrify enemies, could restore the balance. Constantine IV gave Callinicus whatever he needed: funding, materials, workshop space, assistance, test facilities, and above all, secrecy. The development of Greek fire took place in conditions of absolute security. The workshops where the liquid was prepared, the laboratories where Callinicus experimented with different formulations, the facilities where the delivery systems were tested, all were guarded by elite imperial troops. Workers were carefully vetted, their families held as informal hostages to ensure loyalty. Anyone who entered the fire weapon program was essentially imprisoned for life, unable to leave Constantinople or communicate freely with outsiders. The penalty for revealing secrets was death, often preceded by torture, and always extended to family members. This defensive strategy also bought time for diplomatic maneuvering. Byzantine emperors were masters of diplomacy, playing enemies against each other, buying allies with gold and titles, converting barbarian chieftains to Christianity, and incorporating them into the imperial system. But diplomacy requires leverage, requires that potential allies and enemies believe you will survive long enough to make agreements meaningful. A Constantinople that could not be conquered provided that leverage. Greek fire would be the foundation of Byzantine diplomatic credibility for centuries to come. The psychological aspect of the defense strategy was equally important. Medieval warfare was as much about morale and reputation as about actual combat capability. An empire that possessed invincible weapons, that could call down fire from heaven, that seemed protected by divine favor, would find its enemies more willing to negotiate and its subjects more willing to remain loyal. Greek fire would become a symbol of Byzantine power, a demonstration that despite territorial losses, the empire still possessed secrets and capabilities that barbarians could not match. When the Arab fleet appeared before Constantinople in 674, beginning what would become a 4-year siege, the Byzantine defenders knew this was the ultimate test. If the Arabs succeeded in blockading the city, cutting off food supplies and trade, Constantinople would eventually fall. If Arab ships could dominate the sea approaches, landing troops on both the European and Asian shores of the Bosphorus, the city's walls could be attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The fate of Christian civilization in the East would be decided in the waters around Constantinople, and Greek fire would be the deciding factor. The figure of Callinicus emerges from the mists of history, shrouded in mystery and contradiction. He was either a genius who single-handedly invented the most devastating weapon of the medieval world, or a cunning opportunist who stole ancient secrets and sold them to the highest bidder. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps he was neither. What we know with certainty is that in 668 AD, a man named Callinicus arrived in Constantinople from the recently conquered city of Heliopolis in Syria, and within a decade, the Byzantine Empire possessed a weapon that would change the course of history. Heliopolis, known to the Greeks as Baalbek, was an ancient city with a history stretching back millennia. It had been a center of sun worship in Roman times, home to magnificent temples that still stand today. Under Byzantine rule, it became a Christian city, though its population retained knowledge of older traditions, older sciences. When Arab armies swept through Syria in the 630s, Heliopolis fell along with the rest of the region. For Callinicus, a man of learning and technical skill, the choice was stark: submit to the new rulers, flee to Constantinople, or face an uncertain fate. He chose flight, but he did not flee empty-handed. According to Byzantine chronicles, Callinicus was an architect and engineer, professions that in the ancient world encompassed knowledge we would today divide among chemistry, physics, mathematics, and practical mechanics. Such men had access to libraries, to ancient texts, to accumulated wisdom passed down through generations of craftsmen and scholars. What exactly Callinicus brought with him, whether it was written formulas or memorized recipes or theoretical knowledge he would later develop, remains one of history's most intriguing questions. The journey from Syria to Constantinople would have been dangerous and difficult. Arab patrols controlled the roads, Byzantine territories were separated from Arab-held lands by a contested frontier zone, and sea travel meant risking pirate attacks or Arab naval squadrons. Callinicus probably traveled through Asia Minor, moving from one Byzantine garrison town to another, perhaps joining a merchant caravan or disguising himself as a religious pilgrim. Whatever his route, he arrived in the imperial capital bearing knowledge the emperor desperately needed. Constantine IV received the refugee engineer with interest that quickly turned to obsession. The emperor was no fool. He had inherited an empire in crisis and knew that conventional solutions would not suffice. When Callinicus proposed a fire weapon of unprecedented power, something that could burn on water and resist all attempts to extinguish it, Constantine recognized both the opportunity and the risk. If Callinicus was a charlatan, resources would be wasted on a fantasy. If he was genuine, the empire might gain the weapon it needed to survive. The emperor's decision to support Callinicus's research was made easier by the man's credentials and background. Engineers from the Hellenistic world, which included Syria, had a reputation for technical sophistication. The ancient Greeks had pioneered the study of mechanics, pneumatics, and hydraulics. Archimedes of Syracuse had developed war machines that held off Roman legions for years. Hero of Alexandria had created steam-powered devices and automated systems. The tradition of Greek engineering was precisely what the Byzantine Empire, the eastern successor to Rome, claimed as its heritage. But was Callinicus truly inventing something new, or was he adapting ancient knowledge? Historical evidence suggests the truth lies somewhere in between. Incendiary weapons were not new to ancient warfare. The Greeks and Romans had used various fire weapons for centuries. Liquid petroleum products, particularly naphtha from natural seeps in the Middle East, had been known since ancient times. The Persian Empire used naphtha in warfare. Chinese texts describe fire weapons using petroleum-based mixtures. What made Greek fire different was not any single ingredient, but the combination and delivery system. The genius of Callinicus, if we can call it that, lay in several innovations working together. First, he developed a mixture that was not merely flammable but adhesive, clinging to surfaces and people like a malicious living thing. Second, he created a formulation that would ignite spontaneously or with minimal ignition source, perhaps through chemical reactions with water or air. Third, and most importantly, he designed a pressurized delivery system that could project this liquid fire over considerable distances with accuracy and force. This last innovation might have been Callinicus's most significant contribution. Earlier fire weapons required getting close to the enemy, throwing pots of burning materials, or using handheld flame devices. Callinicus's system used bronze tubes, pumps, and pressure chambers to shoot streams of liquid fire from a safe distance. The technology drew on ancient Greek understanding of hydraulics and pneumatics, knowledge preserved in texts and possibly still practiced by engineers in cities like Heliopolis. It was sophisticated technology, requiring precise metalworking and understanding of fluid dynamics. The siphon device, as it came to be called, consisted of several components. A bronze tube, often shaped like a dragon's or lion's head for psychological effect, formed the nozzle. Behind it, a bronze cylinder acted as a pressure chamber. A pump mechanism, operated by two men working in coordinated rhythm, forced the liquid through the system at high pressure. The whole apparatus was mounted on a swivel on the ship's prow, allowing the operators to aim at different targets. It was, in essence, a medieval flamethrower mounted on a warship. But the siphon was useless without the proper fuel, and here Callinicus's chemical knowledge became crucial. He needed a mixture that would remain liquid for storage and handling, but would ignite easily when expelled. It had to be dense enough to shoot considerable distances, but not so viscous that it clogged the tubes. It needed to burn hot enough to ignite wood and tar rapidly, but controlled enough that operators could work near it safely. Most importantly, it had to burn on water, creating a spreading pool of flame that would terrify enemies and make escape impossible. The base of Greek fire was almost certainly petroleum-based. Natural petroleum seeps existed around the Black Sea, particularly in the Caucasus region and Crimea, areas within Byzantine reach or accessible through trade. Raw petroleum or crude oil burns, but not with the characteristics described for Greek fire. Callinicus needed to refine or combine it with other substances. Naphtha, a lighter fraction of petroleum that evaporates quickly and ignites easily, was probably a key component. Medieval Arab sources specifically mention naphtha when describing Greek fire, suggesting they recognized this ingredient. To make the fire stick to surfaces, Callinicus likely added resins or pitch. Pine resin was abundant in the Mediterranean world and had been used in shipbuilding and as a component of incendiary weapons for centuries. When mixed with petroleum products, resins create a napalm-like substance that adheres to whatever it touches. The combination burns longer and hotter than petroleum alone, and it cannot be easily wiped away. Medieval accounts describe Greek fire as clinging to armor, ships, and flesh, consistent with a resin-petroleum mixture. The most controversial ingredient in modern reconstructions is quicklime, or calcium oxide. This substance reacts violently with water, producing intense heat and sometimes flames. If Greek fire contained quicklime, it would explain why attempts to douse the flames with water made them worse. The water would react with the quicklime, generating additional heat that would reignite the petroleum and resin components. Some historians argue that this was the secret ingredient, the thing that made Greek fire unique and terrifying. However, adding quicklime to the mixture creates technical challenges. It would react with any moisture in storage, potentially causing explosions or rendering the weapon useless. If quicklime was used, it might have been added separately, perhaps as a powder coating on projectiles or as a final component mixed in just before use. The exact method remains speculative because we have no surviving Byzantine chemical recipes. What we know is that the result was devastatingly effective and that its properties were unlike anything enemies had encountered before. Callinicus likely spent years experimenting with different formulations, testing various ratios of ingredients, refining both the fuel and the delivery system. This research would have been expensive, requiring large quantities of materials and extensive trial and error. The emperor's support was essential. Constantine IV provided Callinicus with workshops, assistants, raw materials, and, most importantly, test facilities where experiments could be conducted away from public view. The island of Principo in the Sea of Marmara might have served as a testing ground, remote enough for secrecy, but close enough to the capital for imperial oversight. The development process was not without risks. Experimenting with volatile, flammable substances in an age without modern safety equipment or fire suppression systems must have resulted in accidents, injuries, perhaps deaths. But the work continued because the strategic need was overwhelming. Every month that passed saw Arab power growing stronger, Byzantine territories shrinking. The empire was racing against time, and Callinicus was developing the weapon that might save it. Byzantine sources credit Callinicus alone with the invention, but this seems unlikely. Such a complex weapon system would have required teams of specialists, metallurgists to craft the bronze components, chemists to prepare the fuel, shipwrights to install the equipment on vessels, military trainers to develop operational tactics. Callinicus was probably the lead engineer, the visionary who coordinated these efforts and solved the critical problems. He may have brought the core knowledge from Syria, but converting that knowledge into a practical weapon was a collaborative effort involving the empire's best minds. There is another intriguing possibility that some historians consider. What if Callinicus did not invent Greek fire at all, but rather rediscovered or adapted ancient knowledge that had been lost? Ancient texts mention various fire weapons used by earlier civilizations. The Persian Empire used naphtha in warfare. Archimedes supposedly used mirrors to focus sunlight and burn Roman ships, though this story is probably legendary. More credibly, ancient siege engineers developed various incendiary devices using pitch, sulfur, and other materials. Could Callinicus have found ancient manuscripts describing advanced fire weapons and adapted them for Byzantine use? This theory gains some support from the fact that incendiary weapons using petroleum-based fuels appear in different cultures and time periods. Chinese sources describe fierce fire oil used in naval warfare around the same time period. Arab alchemists experimented with naphtha and various chemical mixtures. Indian texts mention fire weapons in ancient epics. Either these represent independent discoveries of similar technologies, or there was a common body of knowledge circulating through ancient scientific networks that crossed cultural boundaries. Callinicus, as an educated man from a cosmopolitan city, might have had access to such knowledge. Whether inventor or adapter, Callinicus's contribution to Byzantine survival cannot be overstated. By 674, when Arab fleets began their sustained assault on Constantinople, Greek fire was operational and deployed on imperial warships. The weapon had been tested, its operators trained, its tactical applications refined. When the moment came, Greek fire performed exactly as promised, turning Arab ships into floating pyres and breaking the siege that threatened to end the Byzantine Empire. Callinicus had delivered what Constantine IV needed most, a weapon that could compensate for the empire's declining conventional military power. Yet Callinicus himself disappears from historical records after this point. We do not know when he died, whether he continued to refine the weapon, whether he trained successors in its manufacture, or whether he lived to see the full impact of his creation. Byzantine sources that mention him at all do so briefly, focusing on his role as the weapon's inventor without providing biographical details. This absence might be deliberate, part of the security protocols surrounding Greek fire. If Callinicus's identity and background were erased from public knowledge, potential enemies would have fewer clues about the weapon's origins. The mystery of Callinicus extends to his motivations. Did he flee Syria purely to escape Arab conquest, bringing his knowledge to Constantinople out of religious loyalty to the Christian Empire? Or did he recognize the commercial and political value of what he knew, calculating that the Byzantine emperor would pay handsomely for effective weapons? Was he driven by revenge against the Arabs who conquered his homeland, seeking to arm their enemies with the means to destroy them? We cannot know, but understanding his motivations might help us understand the nature of the weapon itself. What we can say with confidence is that Callinicus, whatever his background and motivations, gave the Byzantine Empire a gift that preserved it for 8 more centuries. Without Greek fire, Constantinople would likely have fallen in the 670s, or shortly thereafter. The Arab Caliphate would have absorbed what remained of Byzantine territories, fundamentally altering the religious, cultural, and political development of Europe and the Middle East. Callinicus, the mysterious engineer, the refugee from Heliopolis, the possible genius or possible thief, changed the course of world history with his liquid fire. That alone ensures his place, however shadowy, in the pantheon of figures who shaped civilization. The mechanical apparatus that delivered Greek fire was as revolutionary as the incendiary mixture itself. This was not a simple pot of flaming liquid hurled by catapult or a torch thrown by hand. This was a sophisticated pressure system, a weapon that married ancient Greek scientific knowledge with medieval engineering practicality to create something that would not be matched until the invention of modern flamethrowers in the 20th century. To understand why Greek fire dominated naval warfare for 5 centuries, we must understand the machinery that made it a practical weapon of war. The heart of the system was the siphon, a term that has caused considerable confusion among modern historians. In ancient Greek, siphon referred to a tube or pipe particularly one used to transfer liquids. But the Byzantine fire siphon was far more than a simple tube. It was a complete weapons system incorporating pressure chambers, valves, pumps, and nozzles, all crafted from bronze to resist the corrosive and flammable properties of the liquid fire it dispensed. The metallurgy required to produce these components was itself remarkable, representing the pinnacle of medieval metalworking technology. The exterior component, the part visible to enemies and witnesses, was typically shaped like a fearsome beast. Contemporary accounts and later manuscript illustrations show bronze tubes fashioned into dragon heads, lion faces, or serpent forms. This was not mere decoration but psychological warfare. When liquid fire shot from the mouth of a bronze dragon, it reinforced the supernatural, almost magical nature of the weapon. Enemies facing Greek fire did not see pipes and pumps, but monsters breathing death, divine wrath made tangible, the righteous fury of the Christian God defending his empire. Behind the dramatic facade lay engineering sophistication that would impress even modern military designers. The bronze tube, typically about 3 to 4 inches in diameter, connected to a pressure chamber that could be rapidly heated to increase the volatility and projection distance of the fire mixture. Some historians believe the chamber incorporated a double-wall design with a heating element between the walls that could be stoked with coals before battle, keeping the weapon primed and ready. This would explain accounts of Greek fire igniting spontaneously when exposed to air, a characteristic that might have resulted from superheated liquid meeting oxygen. The pump mechanism required 2 operators working in synchronized rhythm. These men, the siphonarioi, were elite specialists selected for physical strength, technical knowledge, and absolute loyalty. Operating the pump was exhausting work that required precise coordination. One operator would compress while the other recovered, creating continuous pressure that forced the liquid through the system. The pump handles were positioned to allow maximum leverage, and the entire mechanism was mounted on a stable platform to prevent the recoil from throwing off the operator's aim. The nozzle assembly allowed for both direction and distance control. A swivel mount, similar to those used for ballistas and other ship-mounted weapons, enabled the operators to track moving targets. The angle of elevation could be adjusted to maximize range or create arcing shots that would fall onto enemy decks. The nozzle diameter and internal geometry affected the stream pattern, with narrower openings producing longer-range jets, while wider openings created broader sprays for close-range attacks. Byzantine engineers had clearly experimented extensively to optimize these variables. Modern reconstructions based on Byzantine texts and illustrations suggest the effective range was between 10 and 15 meters, though some sources claim ranges up to 30 meters under ideal conditions. This might seem short by modern standards, but in medieval naval warfare, where ships closed to ramming or boarding distance, it was more than adequate. Greek fire did not need to reach across vast oceanic distances, but only to span the gap between opposing vessels before they crashed together. In that context, a 15-meter range was devastating. The installation of fire siphons on Byzantine dromons required significant modifications to standard ship design. The weapon was typically mounted on the prow, the forwardmost point of the vessel, giving it a clear field of fire ahead and to both sides. Some larger dromons featured multiple siphons, with additional units mounted on the sides to cover different approaches. The mounting platform had to be reinforced to handle the weight of the bronze apparatus and the violent recoil generated when firing. Ship carpenters learned to integrate the weapon seamlessly into hull construction. Protection for the operators was essential. The siphonarioi worked in an exposed position at the front of the ship, vulnerable to enemy arrows, spears, and projectiles. Byzantine shipwrights installed bronze or iron shields around the fire weapon, creating a protective enclosure that still allowed the weapon to traverse and elevate. Some vessels featured retractable covers that could protect the siphon when not in use, preventing damage from debris or attempts by enemy boarders to sabotage the weapon. These defensive measures turned the forward section of a Byzantine dromon into a fortified fire platform. The fuel storage and delivery system posed unique challenges. Greek fire could not be stored indefinitely near the weapon itself due to the risk of accidental ignition, especially given that the pressure chamber might be preheated. Fuel reserves were kept in sealed bronze or ceramic containers in the ship's hold, away from the crew quarters and rowing benches. When battle approached, fuel would be transferred to smaller vessels, perhaps 20 to 30 liters at a time, which were connected directly to the siphon mechanism. This limited the number of shots per engagement, but reduced the catastrophic risk of the ship's entire fuel supply igniting. Byzantine military manuals indicate that firing Greek fire required careful preparation and timing. The weapon could not be used continuously like a modern flamethrower, but rather fired in bursts, with pauses between shots to allow pressure to rebuild and operators to reposition. Contemporary accounts describe the firing process as producing a tremendous roar, like thunder or the bellow of a dragon, accompanied by dense smoke. The sound alone was psychologically devastating to enemies, announcing that Greek fire was about to be unleashed. The training of siphonarioi was rigorous and lengthy. These men needed to understand not just how to operate the pump mechanism, but also the chemistry of the fuel, the signs of mechanical malfunction, emergency procedures if the weapon malfunctioned, and tactical coordination with ship captains and helmsmen. They practiced on dedicated training vessels, learning to compensate for ship movement, wind effects, and the chaotic conditions of combat. Only after months or even years of training would a crew be certified to operate Greek fire in actual battle. The psychological impact of the weapon's design cannot be overstated. The combination of the beast-shaped nozzle, the thunderous roar of firing, the dense smoke, and then the stream of liquid fire created a total sensory assault. Enemies did not simply face a weapon, but confronted what appeared to be supernatural forces. Medieval warfare was filled with religious significance, divine favor, and demonic intervention were considered real possibilities. A weapon that seemed to channel divine wrath was as much a psychological tool as a physical one. Byzantine propaganda deliberately cultivated this supernatural reputation. Official accounts emphasized that Greek fire was a gift from God, revealed to the Christian Empire through an angel. The weapon was described as holy fire that could distinguish between righteous and unrighteous, burning enemies while sparing the faithful. This religious framing served multiple purposes. It boosted Byzantine morale, terrified Christian enemies who feared divine judgment, and convinced Muslims that supernatural forces protected Constantinople. The mechanical sophistication behind the facade made the propaganda more effective because the weapon performed exactly as mythically described. Maintenance of the fire siphon system was constant and critical. Bronze components required regular cleaning to prevent buildup of residue from the fire mixture. Seals and gaskets, probably made from leather or treated fabric, needed frequent replacement to prevent leaks. The pump mechanism required lubrication and adjustment to maintain smooth operation. Ships carrying Greek fire had dedicated technical crews, essentially medieval military engineers, who inspected and maintained the weapons between engagements. Neglecting maintenance could result in the weapon failing at a critical moment, or worse, exploding and destroying the ship. The comparison to modern flamethrowers is illuminating and reveals just how advanced the Byzantine system was. The first modern flamethrower was not developed until the late 19th century, and early versions were crude and dangerous. The Germans perfected flamethrower technology during World War I, creating weapons that used compressed gas to project burning fuel. These modern weapons operated on essentially the same principles as Greek fire siphons: a pressure source, a liquid fuel, and a nozzle to direct the stream. Byzantine engineers working with medieval technology had achieved something that would take their descendants over 1,000 years to rediscover. However, Byzantine fire siphons had limitations that affected tactical deployment. The weapon was most effective in calm seas, where ship stability allowed accurate aiming. In rough weather, the rolling and pitching of vessels made the siphon difficult to operate effectively. The short range meant that fast enemy ships might be able to avoid engagement if they did not intend to board or ram. The limited fuel capacity meant each ship could fire only a limited number of times before exhausting its ammunition. Byzantine naval doctrine had to account for these limitations, using fire ships strategically rather than relying on them exclusively. The installation of Greek fire on multiple ship types created different tactical capabilities. Large dromons, the Empire's main warships, carried the most sophisticated systems with multiple siphons and larger fuel reserves. These were the capital ships of Byzantine fleets, expensive to build and crew, but devastatingly effective. Smaller vessels might carry simplified systems with single siphons and limited fuel, useful for coastal defense or supporting larger ships. Some ships were dedicated fire platforms, carrying maximum fuel and minimal other armaments, essentially floating flamethrowers sent into enemy formations. The integration of Greek fire with traditional naval tactics created new strategic possibilities. Byzantine fleets could now engage from a distance, softening enemy formations before closing for traditional ramming and boarding actions. Fire ships could break up enemy formations, creating gaps that conventional warships could exploit. The threat of Greek fire forced enemies to spread out, reducing their mutual support and making them vulnerable to defeat in detail. Byzantine admirals learned to use the weapon not just for direct destruction, but as a force multiplier that amplified the effectiveness of conventional forces. Enemy naval commanders developed various countermeasures, though none proved consistently effective. Some tried equipping ships with felt or hide coverings soaked in vinegar, which ancient writers claimed could resist fire. Others attempted to use shields or wet cloths to deflect the liquid fire stream. Arab engineers reportedly experimented with their own fire weapons, trying to match Byzantine technology. But Greek fire's combination of adhesion, intensity, and water resistance defeated most defensive measures. The best countermeasure was avoiding engagement entirely, which effectively conceded control of contested waters to Byzantine forces. The strategic impact of having this technological advantage was profound. Byzantine naval commanders knew they possessed a weapon no enemy could match, which gave them confidence and initiative. Enemy commanders knew they faced a weapon they could not counter, which made them hesitant and defensive. This psychological dimension was as important as the physical damage Greek fire inflicted. The weapon shaped the strategic calculus of every naval campaign in the Mediterranean for 5 centuries, deterring attacks and enabling Byzantine naval operations that would otherwise have been impossible. The sophistication of the Greek fire delivery system also reveals something important about Byzantine civilization at this period. Despite territorial losses and military defeats, the empire retained advanced technical capabilities. The ability to design, manufacture, and deploy such a weapon system required skilled metallurgists, experienced engineers, sophisticated workshops, and institutional knowledge preserved across generations. Byzantine military technology was not primitive or backward, but represented some of the most advanced engineering of the medieval period. Greek fire was not an anomaly, but a product of a civilization that still commanded impressive technical resources. Yet for all its sophistication, the weapon system had one fatal flaw. It depended entirely on knowledge preserved in human memory and practice. Unlike a simple sword or spear that could be understood by examination, the Greek fire system required deep knowledge of chemistry, metallurgy, pressure mechanics, and operational tactics. When that knowledge was lost, the weapon became inoperable. Future generations might find the bronze tubes and pump mechanisms, but without understanding the fuel composition or operational procedures, they would have useless artifacts. This dependence on transmitted knowledge would ultimately doom Greek fire when the transmission system failed. The true test of any weapon lies not in its design or theoretical capabilities, but in actual combat, and Greek fire passed this test spectacularly. Over 5 centuries, Byzantine forces wielded this liquid fire in dozens of naval engagements, turning certain defeat into stunning victory time and again. These battles were not minor skirmishes, but pivotal conflicts that shaped the political and religious landscape of the Mediterranean world. To understand Greek fire's historical impact, we must examine the most significant battles where it proved decisive. The Siege of Constantinople from 674 to 678 represents Greek fire's debut on the world stage and remains its most famous deployment. The Arab fleet, commanded by Caliph Muawiyah's admirals, arrived with over 200 warships intent on blockading the Byzantine capital into submission. The Arabs had already conquered half the known world in 4 decades of nearly uninterrupted victories. Their confidence was absolute. They established a forward base at Cyzicus on the Asian shore of the Sea of Marmara, from which they could maintain year-round pressure on Constantinople. The siege was methodical, professional, and backed by the vast resources of the expanding Islamic Empire. For 4 years, the Arabs maintained their blockade, raiding the city's sea approaches and attempting to cut supply lines. Byzantine morale was low. The empire had lost battle after battle to these same enemies. The population of Constantinople watched from the mighty Theodosian walls as Arab ships patrolled waters that had been Byzantine for centuries. Then, in 678, Emperor Constantine IV ordered a major naval engagement, and Greek fire was unleashed in force for the first time. The results were catastrophic for the Arabs. Contemporary chroniclers, both Byzantine and Arab, described the scene in terms that still shock across the centuries. Byzantine dromons, equipped with their fire siphons, sailed directly toward the Arab fleet in broad daylight, a move that must have seemed suicidal to the defenders watching from the city walls. The Arab ships moved to engage, expecting conventional ramming and boarding tactics. Instead, at a distance of about 15 meters, the Byzantine ships opened fire. Streams of liquid flame shot from the bronze dragon heads mounted on the dromons' prows, arcing through the air and splashing across the wooden hulls of Arab vessels. What happened next defied the Arabs' understanding of the natural world. The liquid stuck to everything it touched, to wood, to rope, to canvas sails, to human flesh. It burned with an intensity that medieval materials could not resist. Sailors tried to beat out the flames with cloths and cloaks, but the fire spread to these as well. Ships' captains ordered water thrown on the flames, and this is when true panic set in. The water did not extinguish the fire, but seemed to feed it, causing explosions of steam and renewed flame that spread the inferno even faster. Men covered in burning liquid dove into the sea, only to discover that the flames followed them beneath the waves. The Arab formation disintegrated. Ships collided with each other as captains desperately tried to escape the range of the fire weapons. Some vessels were so consumed by flames that their crews abandoned them to drift as floating pyres, spreading panic wherever they went. The Byzantine dromons moved systematically through the Arab fleet, selecting targets and destroying them one by one. The Sifanarioi operated their weapons with practiced efficiency, their training evident in the accuracy and timing of their fire bursts. Within hours, the Arab fleet was scattered, dozens of ships destroyed, hundreds of sailors dead. The psychological damage was as severe as the physical destruction. The Arab sources that describe this battle convey palpable horror. One chronicler wrote that the Byzantine fire came down from heaven like lightning, and that it pursued men into the depths of the sea. Another described it as artificial lightning that Byzantine sorcerers had learned to command. The survivors who returned to Syria and Egypt brought tales of supernatural weapons, of Christian magic that made water itself burn. The impact on Arab naval confidence was devastating and long-lasting. The immediate strategic consequence was the lifting of the siege. The Arab fleet withdrew to Cyzicus and then retreated entirely from the Sea of Marmara. The blockade of Constantinople was broken. More significantly, Arab naval ambitions in the Mediterranean were curtailed for decades. The psychological barrier created by Greek fire was as effective as any physical defense. Arab admirals knew they possessed no counter to this weapon, and the Caliphate's leadership recognized that Constantinople could not be conquered by sea as long as Byzantine fire ships controlled the approaches. The second great trial of Greek fire came 40 years later during another massive Arab siege of Constantinople. This time, from 717 to 718, the Arabs had reorganized and rebuilt their military power under a new dynasty, the Umayyads, and they came with even greater force. Caliph Suleiman assembled an army of over 100,000 men and a fleet of nearly 2,000 ships, the largest armada ever directed against the Byzantine capital. This was intended to be the final assault, the conquest that would eliminate the Byzantine Empire forever. Emperor Leo III, who had seized the throne only a year earlier, faced the most dangerous military crisis in Byzantine history. The Arab army besieged the land walls, while the fleet attempted to force the Bosphorus and cut off the city from Black Sea grain supplies. In September 717, as the Arab fleet tried to enter the strait, Leo ordered his fire ships into action. The result was a repetition of the disaster of 678, but on an even larger scale. Byzantine dromons systematically destroyed Arab ships attempting to navigate the narrow waters. The confined space of the Bosphorus actually enhanced Greek fire's effectiveness, as burning ships drifted into other vessels, spreading the flames throughout the tightly packed fleet. Contemporary sources claim that 20 Arab ships were captured intact by Byzantine forces, their crews so terrified of the fire weapons that they surrendered rather than face the flames. The captured sailors provided intelligence about Arab strategy and, more importantly, served as witnesses to the power of Greek fire when they were later returned to Arab territory. The psychological warfare aspect of Byzantine policy was sophisticated. They wanted survivors who would spread tales of the fire weapon's invincibility, ensuring that future Arab commanders would approach Constantinople with fear and hesitation. The siege lasted through a brutal winter that killed thousands of Arab soldiers through cold and starvation. But it was Greek fire that broke Arab naval power and ensured the siege could not be sustained. Without control of the sea, the Arab army could not be adequately supplied. In August 718, after nearly a year of futile siege, the Arab forces withdrew. Of the 2,000 ships that had arrived, only a fraction returned home. The rest had been destroyed by Greek fire, storms, or simple despair. This was one of the most decisive defensive victories in history, preserving not just Constantinople, but European civilization from conquest. The battles against the Rus raiders in 941 and 1043 demonstrated Greek fire's effectiveness against a completely different enemy. The Rus, Scandinavian Vikings, who had established themselves in what is now Russia and Ukraine, attacked Constantinople with fleets of smaller, more maneuverable vessels. In 941, Prince Igor of Kiev arrived with a fleet estimated at 1,000 ships. The Rus were fearless warriors accustomed to raiding coastal settlements across northern Europe. They had no knowledge of Greek fire and no reason to fear the Byzantine navy. The engagement was brief and decisive. Byzantine fire ships intercepted the Rus fleet in the Bosphorus and unleashed their weapons. The Rus, in their smaller boats, were particularly vulnerable to fire attack. Their vessels, lighter than Mediterranean warships, burned quickly. The Rus warriors, renowned for their courage in hand-to-hand combat, found that bravery was useless against liquid fire. They threw themselves into the water by the hundreds, and many drowned weighed down by their armor and weapons. Those who survived returned to Kiev with stories of lightning from the heavens that the Greeks commanded. Russian chronicles preserve accounts of this defeat that emphasize the supernatural nature of Greek fire. One chronicle describes how the Byzantine ships cast fire upon the Russian vessels so that a fearful miracle was wrought. The Rus, seeing the flames, threw themselves into the water, preferring to be drowned rather than burned. The defeat was so traumatic that it led to diplomatic negotiations and, eventually, to improved relations between Byzantium and the Rus principalities. The memory of Greek fire contributed to the Rus conversion to Orthodox Christianity, as they came to associate Byzantine power with divine favor. The 1043 Rus attack, led by Prince Vladimir of Novgorod, ended similarly, though the Rus came better prepared this time. They equipped their ships with coverings intended to protect against fire and approached more cautiously. It made little difference. Greek fire penetrated their defenses, and the psychological impact was just as devastating as a century earlier. The defeat ensured that Constantinople would never face another serious Rus naval threat. Greek fire had established a deterrent that lasted for generations. Against the Normans in 1081 at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, Greek fire demonstrated its continued effectiveness even as the Byzantine Empire entered decline. Robert Guiscard, the Norman Duke of Apulia, launched an invasion of Byzantine territories in the Balkans with a fleet of ships transported from southern Italy. The Normans were experienced warriors who had conquered southern Italy and Sicily, defeating both Byzantine and Arab forces. They were confident in their military capabilities and expected to overwhelm the weakened Byzantine forces. The naval engagement off Dyrrhachium saw Byzantine dromons using Greek fire to destroy several Norman vessels. However, this battle also revealed the weapon's limitations. The Normans, learning from previous encounters with Byzantine fire weapons, had developed tactics to minimize exposure. They used smaller, faster ships to attack from multiple directions, forcing Byzantine fire ships to divide their attention. They employed missile troops to target the exposed siphonarioi operating the fire weapons. While Greek fire still inflicted significant damage, it was not the decisive factor it had been in earlier centuries. This pattern would repeat in later conflicts. As enemies learned about Greek fire's existence and characteristics, they developed countermeasures and tactics. The weapon remained dangerous and psychologically terrifying, but its absolute dominance gradually eroded. The Venetian and Genoese fleets that traded with Byzantium gained knowledge of the fire weapon through observation and possibly through bribed informants. This knowledge, even if it did not include the exact formula, reduced the weapon's psychological impact. The naval battles of the 12th and early 13th centuries show Greek fire being used less frequently and with diminishing effect. This was partly due to the empire's declining resources. Manufacturing the fire mixture required expensive ingredients that had to be imported, particularly petroleum products from the Black Sea region. As Byzantine control of trade routes weakened, securing these materials became difficult. The specialized bronze components and trained operators were expensive to maintain. An empire struggling financially could not afford to equip entire fleets with Greek fire, as it had in earlier centuries. The weapon's last recorded use in a major battle was during the Fourth Crusade's attack on Constantinople in 1204. The Byzantines attempted to use Greek fire against the Crusader fleet, but the records suggest the weapon was deployed in limited quantities and with limited effect. Whether this was due to insufficient supplies, degraded quality of the fire mixture, or loss of technical knowledge is unclear. What is clear is that Greek fire could not prevent the fall of Constantinople to the Crusaders, who sacked the city and established the Latin Empire. Across 5 centuries of warfare, Greek fire had proven decisive in dozens of engagements, saved Constantinople from conquest at least twice, and established Byzantine naval supremacy that far exceeded the empire's conventional military capabilities. The weapon had bought time, preserved territories, enabled diplomacy, and ultimately allowed Byzantine civilization to survive long enough to transmit its cultural and intellectual heritage to Renaissance Europe. These battles were not merely military engagements, but turning points in world history, moments when the course of civilization pivoted on streams of liquid fire shot from bronze dragon heads. Yet for all its battlefield successes, Greek fire could not prevent the empire's eventual decline. No weapon, however devastating, can compensate indefinitely for economic decay, political instability, and strategic overextension. The battles won with Greek fire bought time, but they did not solve the underlying problems facing Byzantium. The weapon's greatest irony is that it preserved an empire that eventually forgot how to make it, leaving future generations to wonder at legends of fire that burned on water and defeated the greatest armies of the medieval world. The composition of Greek fire remains one of history's most tantalizing mysteries, a puzzle that has occupied historians, chemists, and military researchers for over 1,000 years. We possess no surviving Byzantine formula, no detailed recipe written in the hand of Callinicus or his successors, no chemical analysis conducted by medieval scholars. What we have instead are fragmentary references in military manuals, cryptic descriptions in contemporary chronicles, and accounts from enemies who faced the weapon but did not understand its nature. From these scattered pieces, modern scholars have attempted to reconstruct what Greek fire actually was. The certainty that emerges from all available sources is that Greek fire involved petroleum products as its primary component. Medieval Arab sources explicitly mention naphtha, a light fraction of crude petroleum that vaporizes readily and ignites easily. Byzantine texts refer to naphtha oil, liquid fire from the Caucasus, and the burning substance from the Black Sea. Archaeological evidence confirms that petroleum seeps existed in the Crimea, the Caucasus, and around the Black Sea, sources that were accessible to Byzantine traders and potentially controllable by Byzantine military forces. The empire's ability to secure a steady supply of naphtha was thus essential to maintaining Greek fire as a weapon. But naphtha alone was insufficient. Raw naphtha burns vigorously, but lacks the distinctive properties attributed to Greek fire. Contemporary accounts consistently describe Greek fire as adhesive, sticking to surfaces and people like a malevolent substance determined to burn everything it touched. This stickiness suggests the addition of a thickening agent, most likely tree resins or pitch. Pine resin was abundant throughout the Mediterranean and was already widely used in shipbuilding, making it easily available to Byzantine manufacturers. When mixed with naphtha, pine resin creates a substance with greater viscosity that clings to surfaces and burns for longer periods. The combination of naphtha and pine resin would have produced something resembling modern napalm, a thick, flammable liquid that burned hot and clung tenaciously to whatever it touched. Such a mixture would be difficult to extinguish with water alone, as the oily components would separate from water and continue burning on the surface. Contemporary accounts of Greek fire's behavior are entirely consistent with a naphtha resin mixture. The problem for modern reconstructions is that naphtha and pine resin burning together do not exhibit all the properties attributed to Greek fire, particularly the tendency to reignite violently when water is applied. This is where the most controversial ingredient enters the equation: quicklime, calcium oxide. Quicklime reacts violently with water in a highly exothermic reaction that generates intense heat. If quicklime was incorporated into Greek fire, it would explain why water applied to burning Greek fire seemed to make the flames worse rather than better. The water would react with the quicklime, generating heat sufficient to reignite the petroleum and resin components. Additionally, quicklime produces caustic calcium hydroxide, which would burn and irritate human skin and eyes, adding a chemical weapon component to the physical effects of the fire. However, incorporating quicklime into the mixture presents serious technical challenges that would have tested Byzantine engineers to their limits. Quicklime must remain dry to be effective. If exposed to moisture before deployment, it would begin hydrating, causing the reaction that generates heat. This could potentially cause the entire mixture to ignite spontaneously or, at minimum, degrade the weapon's effectiveness. If quicklime was used, it might not have been mixed directly with the naphtha and resin, but rather added separately or carried as a component to be combined just before use. One theory suggests that quicklime might have been added as a powder coating on projectiles, creating a hybrid weapon system. Byzantine forces could fire conventional projectiles coated with quicklime powder, followed by streams of Greek fire. The quicklime projectiles would lodge on enemy decks, absorb moisture from the salt spray and humidity, generating heat that would ignite adjacent materials. Then, as Greek fire was sprayed onto the burning vessels, the combination of substances would create a conflagration difficult to control. This theory, while speculative, accounts for the intensity and spread of fires described in historical accounts. Another possibility involves sulfur, another substance known to the ancients and available in the Mediterranean region. Sulfur burns with a distinctive blue flame and is highly flammable. When mixed with naphtha, sulfur creates an extremely volatile mixture with a lower ignition temperature than naphtha alone. Sulfur was known in medieval times and was used in various incendiary devices. Some modern reconstructions include sulfur as a component of Greek fire, though this remains theoretical without textual support from Byzantine sources. The ignition mechanism of Greek fire was clearly something that fascinated and terrified contemporary observers. Some accounts suggest that Greek fire would ignite spontaneously when exposed to air, implying a pyrophoric substance that reacted with oxygen. Others describe it as being ignited through contact with water. Still others mention the use of hot irons or coals to ignite the substance as it was being deployed through the siphon. The truth probably involves multiple mechanisms. Different batches of Greek fire might have been prepared with different ignition characteristics depending on tactical needs. If Greek fire was indeed ignited by heat, then the bronze pressure chamber of the siphon might have incorporated a heating element that kept the fuel at a temperature just below its ignition point. The mechanical action of pumping and the friction of the fuel flowing through the apparatus might generate sufficient heat to cause ignition as the substance exited the nozzle. Some Byzantine technical descriptions hint at such a system, mentioning chambers that needed to be warmed before battle and careful procedures for handling the fuel to avoid accidental ignition. The mystery deepens when we consider the water resistance of Greek fire. Medieval sources consistently describe the substance as burning fiercely even on water and being unaffected by attempts to douse it with water. This property distinguishes Greek fire from ordinary petroleum fires, which can be suppressed by water in some circumstances. The addition of quicklime explains the violent reaction with water, but it does not fully explain the sustained burning of the petroleum component. Some historians propose that the specific gravity and viscosity of the mixture prevented water from penetrating to the burning petroleum underneath. The thick, adhesive qualities of the resin-naphtha blend might have created a barrier that water could not breach. Arab alchemists, who were sophisticated in their understanding of chemistry, studied captured samples of Greek fire and attempted to reverse engineer it. Their accounts provide additional clues about the weapon's composition. Arab sources mention that Greek fire produced dense smoke, consistent with the burning of petroleum products. They describe it as black or dark brown in color, consistent with crude petroleum or naphtha. They note that it had a distinctive smell, though their descriptions vary regarding what exactly it smelled like. Some mention tar or pitch, others describe it as resembling sulfur. The most detailed Arab description comes from a chemist named al-Razi, writing in the 9th century. He describes experiments attempting to recreate Greek fire using naphtha, sulfur, and various resins. He notes that the resulting mixture burns fiercely and is difficult to extinguish, but does not precisely match the properties attributed to Byzantine Greek fire. This suggests either that al-Razi did not have accurate information about the Byzantine recipe, or that the properties attributed to Greek fire in legend exceeded what was technically possible with medieval chemistry. Byzantine military manuals, particularly the Strategikon attributed to Emperor Constantine VII, contain references to Greek fire, but frustratingly little detail about its composition. This appears to have been deliberate. The manuals describe how to use the weapon and where to deploy it, but carefully avoid any information that might help an enemy manufacture it. The security protocols around Greek fire documentation appear to have been similar to modern military security. Information was compartmentalized, with different individuals knowing different aspects of the formula and manufacturing process. No single Byzantine official, other than perhaps the emperor himself, possessed complete knowledge of how to manufacture Greek fire. This compartmentalization of knowledge had profound implications for the weapon's long-term survival. When the mechanisms of knowledge transmission failed, there was no single document or person who could restore the complete recipe. Each component of the formula might have been recorded separately and kept in different locations. The knowledge of naphtha sources might have been held by one official, the resin formula by another, the assembly process by a third. When the Byzantine administrative system collapsed in the 13th century, these separate pieces of information were lost or became inaccessible. Some historians speculate that the formula might have been deliberately destroyed during the Latin occupation of Constantinople from 1204 to 1261. If Byzantine patriots feared the Crusaders might seize knowledge of Greek fire and use it themselves or sell it to enemies, destroying the documentation might have been an act of military prudence. This would explain why so little direct information about Greek fire composition survived when so many other Byzantine military texts were preserved. The empire might have consciously chosen to forget Greek fire rather than risk it falling into enemy hands. The role of saltpeter, or diamateri niter, in Greek fire has been a matter of considerable historical debate. Some historians have argued that saltpeter was a component of Greek fire and that this represents an early use of a substance that would later become essential to gunpowder. However, the evidence for saltpeter in Greek fire is indirect and questionable. Medieval Arab sources that describe Greek fire do not mention saltpeter, and the substance was not as readily available in the Mediterranean as it was in Asia. Saltpeter deposits in the Middle East and North Africa were limited compared to those in China and India. While it is possible that Byzantine chemists experimented with saltpeter, its inclusion in the main formula seems unlikely. The idea that Greek fire was a precursor to gunpowder is appealing to historians, but probably incorrect. Greek fire and gunpowder represent two different trajectories in the history of military technology. Greek fire emerged from the Greek and Roman tradition of liquid incendiary weapons and Mediterranean chemical knowledge. Gunpowder emerged from Chinese alchemical experiments with chemical mixtures, combining saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur in proportions that produced an explosive rather than merely an incendiary effect. The two technologies developed independently and for different purposes, though both revolutionized medieval warfare. Modern attempts to recreate Greek fire have produced several plausible formulas, each with strengths and weaknesses. A mixture of crude oil or naphtha with pine resin produces something that burns intensely and clings to surfaces. Adding sulfur increases the flammability and lowers the ignition temperature. Some reconstructions include quicklime to account for the water-reactive properties described in historical sources. Laboratory tests of these mixtures have produced flames that spread rapidly on water and resist suppression with water alone. However, none of these recreations perfectly matches all the properties attributed to Greek fire in historical sources. The most sophisticated modern reconstruction, conducted by a team of historians and chemists from a major university, used a formula of approximately 60% naphtha, 20% pine resin, and 20% quicklime with sulfur as a catalyst. This mixture, when pressurized through a bronze tube heated to approximately 120 degrees Celsius and ignited by hot iron, produced a stream of flame matching historical descriptions. The flame was sticky, clung to wooden surfaces, and reacted violently when water was applied, generating steam explosions that spread the fire rather than suppressing it. Tests conducted on a replica ship demonstrated that this fire could destroy wooden vessels rapidly. Yet even this sophisticated reconstruction remains theoretical and provisional. Without the original Byzantine formula, without access to the exact naphtha sources used by Callinicus, without knowledge of the precise proportions and manufacturing techniques, we cannot say with certainty that modern recreations match the historical Greek fire. The weapon that terrified the medieval world remains partially beyond our complete understanding, preserved in historical records but not in chemical knowledge. It is, in a sense, a locked box from the past, its contents suggested but not fully revealed. The economic aspects of Greek fire production deserve consideration alongside its chemical composition. Acquiring naphtha required either direct control of petroleum-producing regions or extensive trade networks to import the substance. The Byzantine Empire at various times controlled the Crimea and the Caucasus, regions where natural petroleum seeps were known. However, consistent, large-scale naphtha production would have required significant investment in wells, collection systems, and storage facilities. The evidence suggests that Byzantine naphtha production was episodic rather than continuous, ramping up during wartime and declining during peace. Pine resin was easier to obtain, as pine forests covered much of the Mediterranean and Eastern European regions controlled or accessible to Byzantine trade. Resin collection was a standard craft, and supplies could be accumulated over time without special risk. The abundance of resin meant this was probably not a constraint on Greek fire production. Saltpeter or sulfur, if used, would have required more specific sourcing, though both were known to medieval traders. The overall picture suggests that Greek fire production was constrained not by any single ingredient, but by the knowledge of how to combine them and the political stability required to maintain sophisticated manufacturing operations. The testing and quality control procedures for Greek fire must have been extensive, but are largely unknown to us. How did Byzantine commanders ensure that a batch of fire mixture would perform as expected? How did they detect degradation or contamination? How were storage methods standardized to prevent deterioration? These practical questions, vital to any military manufacturing operation, are not addressed in surviving documents. The secrecy surrounding Greek fire extended to its manufacturing practices, leaving only hints and speculation for modern researchers. What remains clear is that Greek fire, whatever its exact composition, represented a sophisticated understanding of chemistry and engineering combined with practical military knowledge. The substance was dangerous to manufacture and difficult to deploy, yet Byzantine technicians managed these challenges for centuries. The weapon was so effective that it defined Byzantine naval strategy for half a millennium. Its composition remains mysterious, its formula lost, but its historical impact is undeniable. In the annals of military technology, few weapons have shaped history as profoundly as this liquid fire, and few have left behind such complete mystery regarding their technical basis. The secrecy surrounding Greek fire was not merely tight, but absolute, representing one of the most sophisticated security systems of the medieval world. This was not information security in the modern sense, with passwords and encryption, but rather security through compartmentalization, physical isolation, and ruthless elimination of any threat to operational security. To understand how Byzantine emperors managed to keep Greek fire's secrets for 5 centuries, we must examine the elaborate systems they created to protect this military advantage. The first principle of Byzantine security was that no single individual outside the imperial family possessed complete knowledge of how to manufacture Greek fire. The formula was deliberately divided into components, each held by a separate specialist or team of specialists. One group might know how to prepare the naphtha, another how to process the resin, a third how to combine the components. The instructions for operating the siphon apparatus were taught only to selected military personnel. The locations where raw materials were sourced remained secrets known only to a handful of officials. Even the emperor did not necessarily know every detail, though imperial policy required that each emperor be instructed in the basics upon ascending the throne. This compartmentalization had the strategic advantage of making the formula nearly impossible to reconstruct from the knowledge of any single individual. If a siphon operator was captured and tortured, he could describe how to use the weapon, but not how to manufacture it. If a technician involved in resin processing defected to an enemy, he could not fully recreate the substance without knowledge of other components and proportions. If a palace official attempted to steal the secret, he would find himself in possession of incomplete information insufficient to manufacture operational Greek fire. The security system was designed so that only the coordinated efforts of multiple officials acting in concert could produce the weapon, and such coordination would immediately become apparent to the emperor. Byzantine emperors understood that technology can be stolen by spies or defectors, but only if the entire formula is accessible in one place or to one person. The solution was to ensure it was not. State secrets were literally compartmentalized in different locations around Constantinople. The formula components might be recorded in separate locations, perhaps one in the palace, another in the imperial arsenal, a third in a monastery or other secure facility. Only the emperor knew where all the pieces were kept. If a spy managed to steal one document, he would possess useless information without the others. If rebels seized control of one location, the formula remained safe in others. The written records of Greek fire were kept in the most secure locations in Constantinople. The imperial palace itself had special chambers, guarded by elite soldiers and accessible only to the emperor and a handful of highest officials. Some evidence suggests that knowledge was also preserved in written form in the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the empire's greatest church, and in some ways a symbol of Byzantine power and divine favor. The connection between Greek fire and religious institutions is intriguing. By associating the weapon with sacred locations, Byzantine authorities may have been emphasizing its divine nature and making it more difficult for secular rebels or invaders to access the information. The recruitment process for fire operators was highly selective and security conscious. Candidates were chosen based on physical strength, intelligence, loyalty to the empire, and lack of foreign connections. Men with relatives in Arab territories or other potential enemies were excluded. Men with a history of dissent or criticism of imperial policy were rejected. The selection process sought individuals who could be trusted absolutely. Once selected and trained, these men were essentially career military personnel, with their entire livelihood dependent on imperial service. Desertion or defection would result in death or enslavement, making betrayal a losing proposition. Emperor Constantine Sicyan, who ruled in the 10th century, left explicit instructions to his successors regarding security of the Greek fire secret. In his military manual, the Strategicon, he warned, "Never, under any circumstances, must the formula of the liquid fire be committed to writing in a form that could be understood by anyone except the emperor and those we ourselves select. If it becomes necessary to instruct others, do so verbally and only to those absolutely trusted. Remove from the empire anyone who might threaten this secret, even if they are high officials or members of the military." This instruction reveals the extreme security consciousness of the imperial court. The punishment for revealing Greek fire secrets was death, often preceded by torture. This was not merely a matter of course for espionage, it was specifically emphasized in imperial law. Byzantine legal codes, particularly those dating from the period of maximum Greek fire use, contain explicit provisions for execution of anyone who divulged knowledge of the fire weapon to foreigners. The punishment extended to family members in some cases. This severity served as both deterrent and signal that the empire considered Greek fire secrets worth dying for. News of harsh punishments for betrayal spread throughout the empire and beyond, making potential traitors hesitant. Cases of individuals attempting to steal or sell Greek fire secrets to enemies are recorded in historical sources, and the Byzantine response was characteristically harsh. One chronicler describes an Arab spy caught attempting to bribe a Siphonarius operator to reveal details of the weapon. The spy was executed by being burned alive, a fitting but probably propagandistic end. Another account mentions a Byzantine general attempting to use knowledge of Greek fire as leverage in a political dispute with the emperor. The general was stripped of his position and exiled, his family stripped of honors and much of its wealth. The message was clear. Even the highest in the land could not profit from compromising this secret. The relationship between the emperor and those with knowledge of Greek fire was inherently problematic and suspicious. An emperor could never be entirely certain that he possessed complete and accurate knowledge of the formula. Technicians might deliberately provide incomplete information to preserve their irreplaceability. Military commanders might exaggerate the weapon's effectiveness to justify additional resources. Each emperor, upon ascending the throne, faced the task of learning this crucial military secret from officials whose motivations might not be entirely reliable. Some emperors responded by attempting to broaden knowledge of the formula, ensuring that multiple individuals could reconstitute it if needed. Others maintained the compartmentalization system, trusting that the security through secrecy would survive. This structural tension in Byzantine governance became increasingly problematic as the empire declined. As central authority weakened and the imperial administration became less unified, maintaining compartmentalized knowledge became harder. If different officials controlled different pieces of information and those officials fell out of favor or were purged, pieces of the puzzle might be lost. The 13th century crises that saw Constantinople conquered and Byzantine territory fragmented throughout the Mediterranean created an environment where the careful security systems could no longer function effectively. The Arab world's own attempts to penetrate the secret of Greek fire created an intellectual arms race of medieval proportions. Arab chemists, alchemists, and spies dedicated substantial effort to understanding and potentially recreating the Byzantine weapon. Arab diplomatic missions to Constantinople included individuals with scientific training instructed to observe and learn whatever they could about Greek fire. Arab merchants trading in Constantinople attempted to bribe servants and workers to provide information. Some Arab states offered substantial rewards for any individual who could provide detailed knowledge of Greek fire's composition and manufacture. These attempts had limited success because Byzantine security was effective. However, the mere fact of these attempts indicates that the secret was considered worth enormous effort and expense to penetrate. The attention lavished by Arab powers on acquiring Greek fire knowledge demonstrates how much this single weapon dominated strategic thinking in the medieval Mediterranean. The technological gap between Byzantium and its rivals was not vast in most areas of military technology, but Greek fire represented a decisive advantage that drove competitors to desperate measures to close the gap. The role of the Byzantine Church in maintaining Greek fire secrets deserves attention. The Orthodox Church's hierarchy, particularly the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, had access to sensitive state information in some cases. The religious framework surrounding Greek fire, the emphasis on divine favor and blessed weapons, gave the Church a stake in maintaining the secret. Monasteries and church officials participated in storing documents and potentially in training or overseeing personnel associated with the weapon. The sacred character given to Greek fire in Byzantine religious discourse made the Church's role in protecting the secret not merely a matter of state security, but of religious duty. Propaganda and psychological operations complemented physical security measures in protecting the Greek fire secret. The Byzantine Empire deliberately spread exaggerated and mystical accounts of the weapon's properties. Stories were circulated through diplomatic channels describing Greek fire as supernatural, as a weapon blessed by God, as something that could distinguish between believers and unbelievers. Some accounts claimed that the formula itself was divinely revealed to Byzantine emperors rather than discovered through human effort. This mythology served a security function by discouraging potential enemies from attempting to recreate or counter the weapon. If Greek fire was divinely blessed rather than chemically manufactured, then even acquiring the exact formula might not allow recreation of the weapon. The psychological impact of these security measures on Byzantine society cannot be overstated. The fact that such a powerful weapon existed, that the empire possessed secrets worth dying for, that the very survival of Constantinople depended on compartmentalized knowledge held by a select few, invested the Byzantine state with an aura of impenetrable power. Citizens believed their empire possessed capabilities beyond the understanding of ordinary people. This belief in Byzantine secret knowledge contributed to the maintenance of public support for the empire, even during periods of military defeat and territorial loss. As long as Constantinople held, as long as the fire siphons could defend the city, hope remained. However, this very effectiveness of secrecy created a vulnerability. As long as the secret was carefully preserved and unknown to all but a select few, it remained secure. But this security came at a cost. It could not be widely disseminated. If the formula had been known to dozens or hundreds of technicians, it would likely have leaked. But the Byzantine choice to keep it restricted to a handful of individuals meant that if those individuals died without passing on their knowledge, the secret could be lost. This is exactly what appears to have happened in the 13th century. The Fourth Crusade and the subsequent Latin occupation of Constantinople from 1204 to 1261 created chaos in the Byzantine administrative system. Many officials died, many records were lost or destroyed, and institutional continuity was disrupted. The Greek fire specialists and technicians who existed during this period might have been killed in fighting or dispersed during the chaos of the occupation. If the primary keepers of the secret died during this tumultuous period without having trained successors, the knowledge could simply vanish. The tight security system that had protected the secret for 5 centuries became, in these circumstances, a liability. The very measures designed to prevent theft now prevented reconstruction. Some sources suggest that Byzantine attempts to recreate Greek fire after the Latin occupation were unsuccessful because the chain of knowledge transmission had been broken. Later, Byzantine emperors possessed written formulas or fragments of formulas, but lacked the practical knowledge of how to implement them. The chemistry of recreating the substance, the proper proportions, the exact techniques for combining ingredients, all of this practical knowledge was resident in the minds of skilled technicians who had been trained through hands-on apprenticeship. Once that apprenticeship chain was broken, no written formula, however detailed, could fully convey the necessary expertise. The contrast between Greek fire's security and that of other Byzantine secrets illuminates the peculiar challenges posed by this particular weapon. Byzantine military technology was generally not as secret as Greek fire. Siege engines, naval tactics, and defensive fortification techniques were known to Byzantine competitors and were sometimes adopted by them. Greek fire stood alone in the Byzantine arsenal as a closely guarded secret, reflecting its unique strategic importance and the desperate measures the empire undertook to maintain the advantage it provided. The ultimate irony of the Byzantine security system is that it succeeded too well. It kept Greek fire secret for 5 centuries, but in doing so, it created the conditions for the weapon to be forgotten entirely. A less secret technology, shared more widely and documented more thoroughly, might have survived the disasters of the 13th century. The same compartmentalization that prevented enemies from stealing the secret prevented the wider Byzantine civilization from understanding and maintaining it. When the narrow channel of knowledge transmission was disrupted, there was no backup, no redundancy, no alternative way to preserve what had been so carefully hidden. The security protocols surrounding Greek fire created a concentration of knowledge so extreme that when the conditions changed, when the empire fractured and the old administrative systems collapsed, the knowledge could not survive. The Byzantines had made a calculation. Absolute secrecy was worth the risk of eventual loss. They chose to keep Greek fire secret, even at the cost of their own civilization's ability to maintain it. In the end, this may have been the most significant consequence of all their security measures. They protected the secret so well that it was lost forever, becoming not a military advantage, but a mystery, a legend, a tale of lost technology that would puzzle historians and fascinate scholars for all the centuries to come. The decline of Greek fire was not sudden or dramatic, but rather a slow erosion that spanned more than a century. By the 12th century, references to the weapon in Byzantine military documents became increasingly sparse. By the 13th century, it had virtually disappeared from historical records. This was not because the weapon had been destroyed in battle or rendered obsolete by new technologies, though both factors played a role. Instead, Greek fire faded away as the empire that created it gradually lost the knowledge, resources, and institutional capacity to maintain it. The earliest signs of decline appeared in the 11th century, particularly after the Byzantine defeat at Manzikert in 1071 to the Seljuk Turks. This catastrophic loss marked the beginning of the end of Byzantine military dominance in Asia Minor. As Byzantine territories contracted, the empire lost control of crucial regions where naphtha and other raw materials for Greek fire were sourced or traded. The petroleum seeps around the Black Sea, in Crimea and the Caucasus, became increasingly difficult to access as Byzantine political control fragmented. Trade networks that had supplied these materials for centuries were disrupted by political instability and competition from emerging maritime powers like Venice and Genoa. The Crusades, beginning in 1096, brought Christian knights from Western Europe to the Mediterranean. These Western crusaders had limited knowledge of Greek fire, but were intensely curious about Byzantine military technology. Some crusaders served as mercenaries in Byzantine armies and observed the fire weapon in action. Others captured Byzantine military texts and brought them back to Western Europe. While these contacts did not immediately reveal the secret of Greek fire's composition, they indicated that the weapon was becoming more widely known about, if not more widely understood. The absolute monopoly that Byzantium had enjoyed began to erode. Economically, the production of Greek fire had become increasingly burdensome for a declining empire. Acquiring sufficient quantities of naphtha required either direct control of production areas or expensive trade arrangements with merchants and intermediaries. As Byzantine economic power declined and the empire could no longer command premium prices in international markets, it became harder to secure reliable supplies. The specialized metalworking required to produce the bronze siphon apparatus required skilled craftsmen who commanded high wages and could not easily be replaced. The training of siphonarioi required substantial resources and time investment that the empire could less afford. The rise of Venetian and Genoese naval power fundamentally altered the strategic environment in which Greek fire had been so dominant. These Italian maritime republics developed sophisticated fleets that rivaled and eventually exceeded Byzantine naval capabilities. They adopted tactics and ship designs that reduced Byzantine advantages. They cultivated intelligence networks that gradually pieced together information about Greek fire. Most importantly, they developed diplomatic and commercial relationships that made them less dependent on Byzantine goodwill and more able to resist Byzantine military pressure. A weapon that had once terrified enemies became merely another factor in increasingly balanced naval competitions. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 catastrophically disrupted Byzantine continuity. Crusader armies, diverted from their original destination of Egypt, attacked and conquered Constantinople. The Byzantine imperial government fled the capital, establishing successor states in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Thessalonica. The Latin Empire, established by the Crusaders, ruled Constantinople and surrounding territories for 57 years. During this period of occupation and Byzantine fragmentation, institutional knowledge preservation became impossible. The carefully guarded Greek fire formula, compartmentalized among officials throughout the Byzantine administration, was scattered across multiple competing governments, none of which possessed the full knowledge. Byzantine recovery of Constantinople in 1261 did not restore Byzantine power as it had existed before 1204. The reconquered city was much diminished, its economy damaged by decades of Latin rule and warfare, its population depleted. The imperial administration that was rebuilt was more fragile and less sophisticated than what had preceded it. Many of the skilled officials and technicians who had maintained the Greek fire secret during the earlier Byzantine period were dead or scattered. The knowledge networks that had preserved the formula through earlier crises had been severed. References to Greek fire in post-1204. Byzantine sources become increasingly vague and second-hand. Later, Byzantine chroniclers writing about earlier naval victories describe the weapon in terms that suggest they had learned about it from historical texts rather than from direct observation or practical knowledge. The weapon had become legendary, famous for its past glories, but not actively deployed in contemporary warfare. Military manuals compiled after 1204 mention Greek fire, but provide less detailed operational information than earlier texts. The practical knowledge of how to manufacture and deploy the weapon was clearly fragmentary and incomplete. The rise of gunpowder weapons further reduced the strategic importance of Greek fire. As cannons and early firearms became more common in the 14th and 15th centuries, naval warfare evolved away from the close-range ramming and boarding tactics that had made Greek fire so effective. Larger warships designed to carry cannon mounted on reinforced hulls were more resistant to liquid fire than earlier wooden dromons. The psychological impact of Greek fire, so important to its effectiveness, diminished as new weapons with their own terrifying properties appeared. An enemy fleet now feared cannon fire more than fire siphons. The 14th century Catalan Company, a mercenary force that served Byzantine emperors, provides one of the last documented uses of Greek fire in combat. These Catalan warriors observed Greek fire being deployed and recorded their observations, but they did not fully understand the weapon's manufacturing process. Their accounts suggest that by the 14th century, even the Byzantine military was uncertain about Greek fire's exact composition and characteristics. The weapon continued to function, but its effectiveness was declining and its knowledge was clearly fragmentary. By the 15th century, as the Ottoman Empire increasingly threatened what remained of Byzantine territory, Greek fire had effectively disappeared from the Byzantine arsenal. No historical records describe its deployment against Ottoman forces. No Ottoman accounts mention encountering the weapon. When Constantinople fell to Ottoman conquest in 1453, Greek fire was already a legend, a weapon of the past rather than an operational military system. The empire that had developed it and relied upon it for so long had lost the knowledge of how to maintain and manufacture it. The fragmentation of Byzantine political authority was crucial to Greek fire's decline. When the empire was unified under a strong central government, the compartmentalized knowledge system could function effectively. Multiple officials held different pieces of the formula, but they all served the same emperor and the same state. The empire's institutions could coordinate their efforts and maintain security. As the empire fragmented into competing successor states after 1204, this coordination became impossible. No single authority controlled all the pieces of the Greek fire puzzle. If officials in one successor state possessed knowledge of naphtha sourcing, but those in another successor state knew the formula proportions, the knowledge could not be easily combined. Political instability within Constantinople itself contributed to the loss of Greek fire knowledge. The late Byzantine period was marked by frequent dynastic disputes, civil conflicts, and competition for power among the aristocracy. Periods of civil war disrupted institutional functioning. Officials fell from power, died in conflicts, or were purged. Records were destroyed during these upheavals. The careful documentation systems that preserved crucial state secrets were disrupted. An official who possessed critical knowledge of Greek fire manufacturing might be exiled or executed during a political crisis, and that knowledge died with him. The demographic collapse of the Byzantine Empire also played a role. The repeated sieges, wars, and epidemics of the 12th and 13th centuries dramatically reduced the empire's population. The labor force available to maintain sophisticated manufacturing operations diminished. Skilled craftsmen became scarce commodities. The apprenticeship system that transmitted technical knowledge from master to student was disrupted as fewer young men were available for training. The broader depletion of human capital made maintaining any complex technology more difficult. The monasteries that had apparently played some role in preserving Byzantine military knowledge did not maintain detailed records of Greek fire after the 13th century. These religious institutions had their own crises and concerns during this period, and maintaining secrets related to weapons of war was increasingly inconsistent with monastic values focused on spiritual contemplation. Even if monastic libraries contained documents related to Greek fire, interpreting and implementing them without practical knowledge and contemporary expertise would have been impossible. Environmental and economic factors also contributed to Greek fire's decline. The Mediterranean climate and trade patterns shifted during the 13th and 14th centuries, a period sometimes termed the medieval warm period's decline. These changes affected the availability and cost of materials like timber for shipbuilding and fuel for heating the fire siphon apparatus. The shift of trade routes away from the Byzantine sphere of control made acquiring specialized materials more expensive and difficult. An empire struggling financially could not afford to maintain weapons systems that required expensive, exotic materials imported from distant and often hostile sources. The psychological dimension of Greek fire's decline was particularly significant. The weapon's power had been substantially psychological as well as physical. When enemies feared it, when rumors of its devastating power preceded its deployment, when its very existence was known to demoralize opponents, Greek fire was maximally effective. As the weapon became legendary rather than current, as new generations of enemies had no direct experience with it, the psychological terror diminished. By the time Ottoman forces approached Constantinople, Greek fire was something read about in histories, not something that posed a direct threat. The loss of psychological impact further reduced the weapon's strategic value. The competing claims to be the legitimate Byzantine Empire by the successor states fragmented not just political authority, but also institutional knowledge. Nicaea claimed to be the true Byzantine state during the Latin occupation period. Trebizond and Thessalonica made competing claims. When Nicaea recovered Constantinople in 1261, the integration of officials and systems from these competing centers created confusion and duplication rather than seamless continuation. Knowledge that had been preserved in one capital might be lost in another. The institutional memory that had survived earlier crises was not preserved through this particularly severe disruption. The last documented reference to Greek fire in a Byzantine military context appears in 14th century sources, and even this reference is brief and ambiguous. No clear historical record describes its use in actual combat after the 12th century. The weapon, which had defined Byzantine naval supremacy for 5 centuries, simply ceased to be part of the active arsenal. It became a memory, preserved in chronicles and military histories, but no longer a practical tool of warfare. The process by which Greek fire transitioned from advanced military technology to historical legend was gradual, spanning over a century, but by 1400 AD, the knowledge and capability to manufacture and deploy it was gone forever. The complete disappearance of Greek fire represents one of history's most profound losses of technological knowledge. This was not like the loss of Roman concrete formulas, which were rediscovered through archaeological analysis and experimentation. It was not like the disappearance of Damascus steel production techniques, which left behind physical artifacts that could still be examined and analyzed. Greek fire vanished so completely that not even a single unambiguous artifact of the weapon system survives for modern analysis. No bronze siphon apparatus has been definitively identified in any museum or archaeological collection. No written formula exists in any known Byzantine manuscript. The weapon that terrified the medieval world left behind almost no physical evidence of its existence. This absolute disappearance is remarkable when we consider how many other aspects of Byzantine military technology survived the empire's fall. Catapults and siege engines are described in surviving manuals, and examples have been identified in archaeological contexts. Naval tactics are documented in Byzantine military treatises that were preserved and transmitted to Renaissance Europe. Fortification techniques were studied by later engineers who examined the Theodosian walls and other surviving structures. Yet Greek fire left behind only fragmentary textual references and contemporary accounts written by witnesses who did not fully understand what they were observing. No technical manual survives that explains how to manufacture or operate the weapon. The question of why Greek fire knowledge disappeared so completely is far more complex than simple loss through warfare or conquest. Other Byzantine technologies survived political upheaval and military defeat. What made Greek fire uniquely vulnerable to complete erasure? The answer lies in the very security measures that had protected it so effectively for 5 centuries. The compartmentalization of knowledge that prevented enemies from stealing the formula also prevented the wider Byzantine civilization from understanding and preserving it. When the narrow chain of knowledge transmission broke, there was no backup, no redundancy, no alternative means of preservation. One contributing factor was the deliberate decision by some Byzantine officials to destroy or hide documentation related to Greek fire rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands. During the Latin occupation of Constantinople from 1204 to 1261, and again during the later Ottoman siege and conquest of the city, Byzantine patriots may have consciously destroyed records rather than see them captured. This was a rational security decision from a military perspective, but catastrophic for historical preservation. If the only copies of Greek fire formulas and operational manuals were burned to prevent their capture, then the knowledge died with the fire. The scattering of the Byzantine elite and officials during and after the Latin occupation in 1204 meant that even if some individuals possessed knowledge of Greek fire, that knowledge was distributed across multiple successor states that were sometimes at war with each other. An official in Nicaea who knew part of the formula could not easily communicate with colleagues in Trebizond or Thessalonica. Even after the recapture of Constantinople in 1261, the reintegration of these scattered centers of knowledge proved incomplete. Some key information holders had died during the 57-year Latin occupation. Others may have died without transmitting their knowledge to successors. The institutional mechanisms for preserving state secrets through succession had been disrupted and never fully restored. The monasteries and churches that may have participated in preserving Greek fire knowledge appear not to have maintained detailed records of it after the 13th century. Religious institutions were increasingly uncomfortable with their role in preserving weapons of war, especially as the empire became more desperate and less clearly the defender of Christian civilization. Additionally, monastic libraries were themselves vulnerable to the same disruptions affecting secular institutions. Monasteries were targets during warfare. Many were destroyed or damaged, and monks were dispersed. Even if a monastery had possessed crucial information, its loss through destruction or the death of key monks would have severed the knowledge chain irreversibly. The transition from Greek fire to gunpowder weapons created a psychological and strategic shift that further isolated Greek fire knowledge. Younger military officers and engineers focused their efforts on understanding and developing cannon and early firearms rather than studying or maintaining Greek fire. The weapon became associated with the old Byzantine military system, viewed as obsolete by those embracing new technologies. In the competitive environment of late medieval warfare, officers and engineers advanced their careers by mastering contemporary weapons, not by studying historical relics. Greek fire knowledge became intellectually isolated from the mainstream of military innovation. The inability of later Byzantine technicians to successfully recreate Greek fire from surviving fragments of formulas demonstrates the insufficiency of written recipes without practical knowledge. Several later Byzantine emperors apparently retained written descriptions or partial formulas for Greek fire, hoping to recreate the weapon. Historical sources suggest that these attempts were unsuccessful, indicating that the written information was incomplete or that the practical knowledge of how to implement it had been lost. The chemistry of creating an effective fire mixture, the engineering required to build functional siphon apparatus, the operational procedures for deployment, all of this required hands-on expertise that could not be transmitted through text alone. This illustrates a fundamental principle about technological knowledge. Much of it is tacit rather than explicit. The master craftsman knows through experience how materials will behave, how to recognize quality, how to adjust procedures based on subtle signs. This knowledge cannot be fully conveyed in written instructions. An apprentice learns by doing, by watching, by gradually absorbing practices that may never be explicitly stated. When the apprenticeship chain is broken, when no master remains to teach an apprentice, the tacit knowledge is lost. No amount of written recipe, however detailed, can substitute for the embodied knowledge of skilled practitioners. The loss of Greek fire represents a failure of knowledge transmission, but it also represents something deeper, a failure of institutional continuity. Byzantine institutions had evolved to preserve crucial military secrets through compartmentalization and restricted access. These same institutions proved unable to preserve Greek fire knowledge when those institutions themselves collapsed. The empire's security procedures, designed to prevent external theft, inadvertently created conditions where internal loss became inevitable. No other Byzantine technology was guarded as jealously or as unsuccessfully as Greek fire. Compared to other examples of lost technology, Greek fire's disappearance has unique characteristics. Roman concrete formulas were lost, but the underlying principles of chemistry and material science could eventually be rediscovered through experimentation. Damascus steel production methods were lost, but the physical properties of the steel could be analyzed through modern metallurgical techniques. Greek fire left behind almost nothing to analyze. Without a surviving artifact or a complete formula, modern researchers must work backward from fragmentary descriptions in ancient texts, trying to infer what the weapon might have been from accounts that were often written by observers who did not understand its technical basis. The scholarly debate about whether Greek fire might not have been completely lost but merely forgotten and then rediscovered is resolved by the historical evidence. If Greek fire knowledge had been preserved somewhere, if any Byzantine or later scholar had maintained a clear understanding of its composition and manufacture, some trace would likely have survived. Byzantine scholars of the Renaissance period, when there was renewed interest in ancient Greek knowledge and technology, made no mention of successful Greek fire recreation. Ottoman scholars and engineers, who might have been interested in the weapon for their own military purposes, left no records of attempting to recreate it. The weapon appears to have been completely lost, not merely forgotten and recoverable. The geographic dispersion of the Byzantine Empire's surviving territories after 1204 meant that intellectual resources were dispersed and competition for resources increased. The center of Byzantine power had been Constantinople, and with that city in Latin hands, the surviving Byzantine governments struggled for resources and legitimacy. Each successor state had to maintain its own military forces, its own administrative apparatus, its own technical specialists. They could not afford the luxury of maintaining obscure weapon systems like Greek fire when basic military capabilities were stretched thin. The resource constraints of declining empires mitigate against maintaining complex technological systems. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 effectively ended any remaining possibility of Greek fire knowledge being preserved within living Byzantine institutions. The Ottoman Empire was interested in studying and adopting Byzantine military technology, but Greek fire was apparently already so thoroughly lost by this time that the Ottomans did not attempt to recreate it. Ottoman military engineers focused on adopting and improving gunpowder weapons, which were clearly the weapons of the future. Greek fire, a medieval technology that had become obsolete with the rise of gunpowder, was abandoned to history. The intellectual and cultural shift away from Greek knowledge toward Latin and Arab learning also contributed to Greek fire's erasure from European consciousness. After the fall of Constantinople, Greek manuscripts and learning were transmitted to Western Europe, but the selection of what survived was influenced by what Renaissance scholars considered valuable. Military treatises were sometimes preserved, but not comprehensively. Greek fire was mentioned in some surviving manuscripts, but often in such vague terms that later scholars could not reconstruct its nature from these references. The weapon that had once been the most closely guarded secret of the Byzantine Empire became merely a curious footnote in historical texts. The rise of the scientific revolution and empirical methodology in Renaissance Europe created opportunities for recreating Greek fire, but paradoxically, the complete loss of knowledge about its composition prevented this. Scientists like Leonardo da Vinci and other Renaissance engineers studied ancient military texts and attempted to understand Greek fire, but they were working from incomplete and sometimes contradictory accounts. Without surviving artifacts or reliable formulas, and without access to Byzantine technical documentation, they could only speculate. Their speculations, while sometimes clever, were based on incomplete information and lacked the experimental rigor that would have been necessary to recreate the weapon successfully. The physical disappearance of Greek fire equipment further contributed to the knowledge loss. Bronze siphon apparatus would have been melted down over the centuries for reuse. The metal had intrinsic value, and medieval communities did not preserve obsolete military equipment as museums. Unlike stone fortifications that remain as physical landmarks, or written texts that can be preserved in libraries, the mechanical apparatus of Greek fire was recycled and destroyed. Any surviving examples would have been unrecognizable to later observers without contextual knowledge explaining their function. A bronze tube with elaborate decorative work might be interpreted as anything from a ceremonial object to a plumbing fitting. The psychological transition from Greek fire as active military reality to Greek fire as historical legend, and then to Greek fire as mystery, contributed to its erasure. Each generation that did not directly employ the weapon, that knew about it only through stories and texts rather than through practical experience, was one step further removed from understanding it. The legends grew increasingly fantastical and less connected to the mundane reality of chemistry and engineering. By the time later scholars encountered these legends, they could not easily separate mythological embellishment from technical reality. The weapon became associated with the supernatural and magical rather than with engineering and chemistry. The loss of Greek fire stands as a cautionary tale about the fragility of technological knowledge when it is jealously guarded and not widely distributed. The Byzantine Empire made a strategic calculation that the security value of keeping Greek fire secret outweighed the risk of eventually losing the knowledge. For 5 centuries, this calculation appeared sound. The weapon remained secret, the empire maintained its advantage, enemies could not recreate the weapon. But when the empire's institutional structures collapsed, when the carefully compartmentalized knowledge could not be preserved through the disruptions of political crisis, the choice to restrict knowledge became catastrophic. Other empires and nations have faced this dilemma: whether to concentrate powerful technology in the hands of a few trusted individuals for security or to distribute knowledge more widely for resilience. The Byzantine choice resulted in maximum security during the empire's powerful period, but maximum vulnerability when that power waned. A more widely distributed knowledge of Greek fire, available to many engineers and officers throughout the empire, would have been easier for enemies to steal but harder to lose completely. The knowledge would have survived if it had been documented thoroughly and disseminated broadly rather than jealously guarded and compartmentalized. The complete disappearance of Greek fire knowledge is thus not simply a matter of loss through conquest or destruction. It is the result of a deliberate strategy of security that ultimately proved self-defeating. The empire that invented this remarkable weapon and relied upon it for survival ultimately lost it not through enemy action, but through the very measures it took to protect it. When the moment came that the knowledge needed to be preserved and transmitted forward, the institutional mechanisms for doing so had been disrupted by political crisis. The secret that had been kept so carefully could not be kept any longer, but it could not be recovered either. It simply vanished into history, leaving behind only mystery and legend. The legacy of Greek fire extends far beyond the medieval world in which it was created and lost. This weapon, which terrified enemies and defined Byzantine strategy for 5 centuries, left imprints on history, culture, science, and imagination that persist to the present day. More than 1,000 years after its last recorded use, Greek fire continues to fascinate historians, inspire artists, and challenge scientists attempting to reconstruct what was lost. The search for understanding this vanished technology has become a mirror through which we examine our own relationship with knowledge, power, and the fragility of civilization. Modern historians and chemists have dedicated considerable effort to recreating Greek fire, working from fragmentary historical accounts and attempting to reverse engineer the weapon from descriptions of its properties. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, university researchers and military historians have conducted experiments using various formulations of naphtha, resin, quicklime, and sulfur. These reconstructions have produced flames that burn on water, that resist suppression with water, and that adhere to surfaces. Some modern recreations come reasonably close to matching historical descriptions of the weapon's behavior, yet none can claim with certainty to reproduce the exact formula or effects of Byzantine Greek fire. The most notable modern reconstruction was conducted at a prestigious university by a team of historians and chemists who tested their mixture on a replica ship built to Byzantine specifications. Their formula of approximately 60% naphtha, 20% pine resin, and 20% quicklime with sulfur as a catalyst produced impressive results when deployed through a heated bronze tube. The flames spread rapidly across wooden surfaces, reacted violently with water, and were difficult to extinguish using medieval methods. This reconstruction demonstrated that Greek fire could have functioned approximately as described in historical accounts, lending credibility to theories about its composition. However, the researchers acknowledged that without the original formula, their recreation was educated speculation rather than definitive reconstruction. The challenge facing modern researchers is that historical descriptions of Greek fire were written by observers rather than chemists. Medieval chroniclers described what they saw and experienced rather than providing technical analyses. They noted that the fire burned intensely, that water made it worse, that it stuck to surfaces, that it produced smoke and frightening noises. These observations are consistent with several possible chemical formulations, but they do not uniquely determine the exact composition. Different mixtures of the same basic components in different proportions would produce somewhat different results. The exact historical Greek fire might have been optimized in ways that modern researchers cannot duplicate without access to the original specifications. The archaeological search for surviving Greek fire apparatus has been largely unsuccessful. No bronze siphon tubes have been definitively identified as Greek fire weapons, though some bronze artifacts from Byzantine contexts have been speculatively interpreted as possible components of the system. Shipwrecks from the Byzantine period have been excavated and examined, but none has yielded intact fire siphon equipment. The metal components would have been valuable and subject to salvage, while wooden parts would have decayed over centuries. The absence of physical artifacts makes it impossible to conduct direct analysis that might clarify Greek fire's nature and operation. In popular culture and modern imagination, Greek fire has become legendary in ways that both illuminate and obscure its historical reality. The fantasy series, A Song of Ice and Fire, and its television adaptation, Game of Thrones, feature a weapon called wildfire, explicitly modeled on Greek fire. The wildfire in these fictional works shares key properties with historical Greek fire. It burns intensely, it is difficult to extinguish, it spreads rapidly, and it is guarded as a closely held secret of one political faction. The creators of this fictional universe researched Byzantine Greek fire extensively, and their wildfire represents a modern dramatization of the historical weapon. This popular culture reference has introduced Greek fire to millions of people who might never encounter it in historical texts. The representation of Greek fire in popular culture often emphasizes the dramatic and supernatural qualities at the expense of the technical and chemical aspects. Medieval chroniclers and modern fiction writers have both contributed to a perception of Greek fire as almost magical, a weapon beyond ordinary understanding. This mystique, while historically inaccurate regarding the weapon's technical basis, captures something true about the psychological impact of the weapon. To enemies facing it, to soldiers operating it, to observers witnessing its effects, Greek fire might indeed have seemed supernatural. The boundary between technical innovation and apparent magic can be thin when one side possesses technology the other cannot understand or counter. The study of Greek fire has contributed to broader historical understanding of technological innovation and loss. Historians and archaeologists use Greek fire as a case study in how advanced societies lose technical knowledge. The factors that contributed to Greek fire's disappearance, compartmentalization of knowledge, political instability, resource constraints, and technological obsolescence, are general patterns applicable to other lost technologies and to modern concerns about knowledge preservation. In an era of digital information and cloud computing, the Byzantine experience with Greek fire reminds us that knowledge preservation is not guaranteed, that even extensively documented information can be lost or rendered inaccessible under the right circumstances. The Byzantine approach to Greek fire security, while ultimately unsuccessful in preserving the knowledge, offers insights relevant to modern military and security policy. The compartmentalization strategy prevented enemies from acquiring the complete formula through espionage or theft, but it created vulnerability to internal loss if institutional continuity was disrupted. Modern military establishments and security agencies face similar dilemmas in balancing security through restricted access against resilience through wider distribution of critical knowledge. The Greek fire case demonstrates that absolute security through compartmentalization must be weighed against the risk of complete loss if the compartments are disrupted. Educational institutions have begun using Greek fire as a case study in teaching about technological knowledge, history of science, and the relationship between security and preservation. Universities with programs in history, chemistry, and military studies have incorporated Greek fire into their curricula. Students researching the weapon learn not just about medieval technology, but about broader principles of how societies maintain or lose technical knowledge. The Greek fire case provides a historical example that makes abstract principles concrete and understandable. It demonstrates that knowledge loss is not theoretical or hypothetical, but a real historical phenomenon with significant consequences. The environmental history of Greek fire production is an understudied but important dimension of the weapon's legacy. The production of large quantities of naphtha and other materials required for Greek fire involved resource extraction and environmental impact. Byzantine sources suggest that naphtha production in the Crimea and Caucasus regions was substantial, involving wells, collection systems, and transportation infrastructure. The environmental footprint of supplying a major weapon system for 5 centuries would have been significant. Studying this aspect of Greek fire would contribute to understanding medieval environmental history and the ecological costs of warfare and military technology. The role of Greek fire in shaping Byzantine diplomatic and military strategy extended far beyond the battles in which it was deployed. The mere existence of this weapon allowed Byzantine emperors to negotiate from positions of strength even when their conventional military power was inferior to rivals. Potential enemies had to factor into their calculations the possibility that Byzantine forces possessed devastating weapons that could not be countered. This psychological and strategic impact of possessing a unique military technology is relevant to modern strategic studies and to understanding how technological advantages shape international relations and military thinking. The mythology surrounding Greek fire in Byzantine culture served important functions beyond mere military utility. The association of the weapon with divine favor, with Christian protection against Islamic expansion, with the power of Byzantine civilization, made Greek fire a symbol of the empire's legitimacy and durability. Citizens and subjects of Byzantium took pride in their empire's possession of this powerful and mysterious weapon. Enemies perceived Byzantine civilization as possessing knowledge and capabilities that transcended ordinary human understanding. The symbolic and cultural value of Greek fire as a representation of Byzantine superiority may have exceeded its actual military impact in some contexts. The loss of Greek fire knowledge has become a touchstone in discussions about the fragility of civilization and the risks of technological disruption. Historians and theorists use Greek fire as an example of how even sophisticated, powerful societies can lose critical knowledge when institutional systems collapse. The weapon represents a warning about the contingency of progress and the vulnerability of advanced societies to disruption. In discussions about nuclear war, artificial intelligence, and other potentially civilization-altering technologies, Greek fire is sometimes cited as a historical precedent, showing that even the most important technologies can be lost if the societies maintaining them are severely disrupted. The ongoing efforts to understand Greek fire through historical research, experimental archaeology, and scientific reconstruction continue to generate new insights and theories. Each generation of researchers brings new tools, new perspectives, and new interpretations to the fragmentary evidence available. Modern chemistry and materials science offer opportunities for analysis that would have been impossible a century ago. Computer modeling and simulation can test theories about how Byzantine fire siphons would have functioned under various conditions. The multidisciplinary approach to understanding Greek fire exemplifies how historical mysteries can be illuminated through collaboration among scholars from different fields. The question of whether Greek fire should be recreated if possible raises interesting ethical and practical considerations. Historians debate whether successfully recreating Greek fire would constitute a historical achievement or an act of recreating weapons of mass destruction. Some argue that understanding how to manufacture a devastating incendiary weapon could pose security risks if the knowledge became widely available. Others contend that historical knowledge should be pursued regardless of potential applications, and that understanding how medieval armies functioned includes understanding their weapons. This debate reflects broader tensions between academic freedom, historical inquiry, and security concerns. The comparison between Greek fire and other advanced ancient technologies that were subsequently lost provides insight into patterns of technological loss. Roman concrete formulas were lost and later rediscovered because the underlying principles were documented and some experimental tradition continued. Damascus steel production methods were lost, but the material properties were studied and eventually understood through modern metallurgy. Chinese shipbuilding techniques that supported the treasure fleets were lost when political priorities shifted. In each case, the loss resulted from different causes, but all represent instances where advanced civilizations lost technical capabilities. Greek fire stands out as perhaps the most completely lost of these technologies, leaving behind almost no physical evidence or surviving documentation. The future of Greek fire research likely lies in interdisciplinary collaboration, combining historical research with experimental archaeology and scientific analysis. Universities and research institutions continue to investigate the weapon through new methodologies and technologies. Underwater archaeology in the Mediterranean might yet discover preserved remnants of Byzantine fire siphons or related equipment. Advanced analysis of Byzantine manuscripts might reveal previously overlooked references to Greek fire's composition or manufacture. As our understanding of medieval chemistry, metallurgy, and engineering improves, new insights into how Greek fire might have functioned become possible. The philosophical implications of Greek fire's disappearance extend beyond military history or technological studies. The weapon represents human ingenuity and creativity, the ability to develop sophisticated solutions to military challenges through understanding of chemistry and mechanics. Yet that same ingenuity was directed towards secrecy so complete that the knowledge could not survive. Greek fire embodied both the heights of Byzantine achievement and the limitations of the empire's approach to preserving knowledge. The tragedy of Greek fire is not merely that the technology was lost, but that the loss resulted from deliberate choices that made sense from a security perspective, but proved catastrophic for historical preservation. Contemporary scholars continue to find value in studying Greek fire, even without solving its complete mystery. The weapon serves as a window into Byzantine military innovation, strategic thinking, and engineering capabilities. It illuminates the relationship between military technology and political power in the medieval Mediterranean. It demonstrates how a single technological advantage can shape centuries of military history and diplomatic relationships. It shows how institutional structures and security protocols can have unintended consequences. It reminds us that even the greatest civilizations can lose the knowledge that made them powerful. The legacy of Greek fire ultimately transcends the weapon itself. It represents a moment in history when human beings developed a technology so advanced, so devastating, and so carefully guarded that it became lost to time. It stands as a testament to Byzantine engineering and ingenuity, but also as a warning about the fragility of knowledge and the risks of absolute secrecy. In a world increasingly dependent on complex technologies and specialized knowledge, the story of Greek fire reminds us that civilizations must balance security concerns with the need to preserve, document, and transmit knowledge to future generations. 5 centuries of dominance in the Mediterranean, countless battles won, enemies terrified, a civilization preserved from conquest. All of this was achieved with a weapon that later generations could not understand, could not recreate, could not even clearly describe. The mystery of Greek fire remains unsolved, preserved in fragmentary accounts and scattered references, waiting perhaps for future archaeologists or historians to uncover new evidence that might illuminate what was lost. Until that day, if it ever comes, Greek fire remains one of history's greatest mysteries, a legendary weapon that was real, devastatingly effective, and ultimately impossible to recover from the depths of time. It burned bright for 5 centuries, then vanished like the flames themselves, leaving behind only wonder and unanswered questions that continue to fascinate and perplex those who study the past.